What's up, everyone? If you don't know me, my name is Zach. I'm the founder of fullstackfoundations.com. And in today's course, we are learning HTML for complete beginners. So this is actually an intro to the intro because I originally filmed this as a series of, I believe, 3 separate videos. You may have seen this on different parts of YouTube. It was posted to Free Code Camp at one point and to my channel as a series of videos. So I wanted to make this intro to kind of let you know that while this can be taken as a freestanding HTML for complete beginners course where you have zero prerequisite knowledge, it was originally filmed under the assumption that you know JavaScript. Okay, so the first hour or so of this course is going to assume no previous knowledge, and it can be taken alone. But then once we get into the second part, or the second video, we start talking about the document object model, which is a bridge between JavaScript and HTML. And then in the final project that we do, where we build a meme generator with HTML, we're going to also incorporate some JavaScript there. So it's your option. You can take the first hour and just brush up on the basics of HTML, or you can go to my free 10-hour Introduction to JavaScript course to get up to speed with JavaScript before you take this. So choose your path. Hope you enjoy this course. And without further ado, let's jump into the lessons. This is an HTML crash course, and I'm really excited to walk you through it, and I want to show you exactly what we're going to build over the next couple of videos. So here is our ultimate challenge that we're trying to create, and what this does is you've got a bunch of buttons here on the right where we can click them, and a random meme is going to be shown to the screen, or you can have a joke displayed on the screen, a quote, or a riddle where you're going to get the riddle and then you have to reveal the answer here. So this is going to be a really fun project, but before we get into it, we have to learn a little bit about HTML. Before we dive into the details of HTML, I want to start with a little bit of an analogy that will help us kind of going forward in this crash course and then also the CSS one in the next lesson. So that analogy is building a house. If you were building a house, you basically have 3 steps. First, you have to build the structure. So that would be the wood, the concrete, the brick, the roofing, all that kind of stuff. Then you have to set up the function of the house. So that would be the plumbing, the electric, the water lines, all of that kind of stuff has to go into the house to make it functional. And then finally, the third step is to make it look good. You obviously don't want to build a house that doesn't look good. You want to paint it correctly, and you want to do some landscaping around it, put some siding on it. All of that stuff is very important for the market value of the house. So if our house was a website, the structure would be the HTML. Now the function, the electric, the plumbing, all that kind of stuff would be the JavaScript. And then the styling, so the paint and the landscaping, that would be the CSS. Now, you could live in your house with just the structure or the HTML. You wouldn't have any function, so you wouldn't have running water, you wouldn't have heat or anything that makes a house livable, but you certainly could live in that house and you'd have a roof over your head. Now, if you add in the function, you could live with just that too. So, add in the electric and the plumbing, and now you've got a house that is functioning, but one that is not worth that much if you went to try and sell it because you haven't painted it, you haven't put landscaping around it, and you haven't made it look attractive to another buyer. So that's where the CSS comes in, that's where the styling comes in. So ultimately, the goal of this analogy is to say that HTML is the only true requirement of a web page. But if you want it to do anything useful, you got to add some JavaScript. And if you want to make it presentable to other people, your users, you have to add in the CSS. So that's just a nice analogy to remember how everything relates to each other and how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript play nicely together to create a full user experience on the web. While these all work together, we're going to be skipping the CSS part in this lesson. So like I said, we've learned a lot about JavaScript in the prior couple of lessons of this Full Stack Roadmap series. And now we're going to learn about HTML. So we're basically going to be focusing only on those two. How do they interact? And just as a hint, it's going to be a big conversation about something called the document object model, or the DOM. And that's basically the model that represents the HTML and allows us to plug our JavaScript into that HTML and make it functional. But at this point, we're getting too detailed. We'll get there in a second. First, we need to understand what is HTML, how does it work, and how do we write it. The first thing that we have to ask is, what is HTML? And it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And despite the last word, language, it's generally not considered a full-on programming language like something like JavaScript that we've been working with before. It's something that allows you to structure your text and all different components that you're going to put on a web page, but it's not a full-on programming language. You can't add in a whole lot of logic behind the scenes and make things dynamic without adding in that JavaScript. Now, there's a ton to talk about with HTML, but similar to how I've been handling other concepts within this series, I'm not trying to get into absolutely everything and do a super deep dive into it. My goal here is to get you exposed and learning the most essential concepts of HTML, those things that you absolutely have to know to build web applications. I think a great place to start is to understand the overall structure of an HTML document. So something you have to understand is that every browser tab that you have open is going to have one and only one HTML document, is what we call it, within it. So that one document follows a standard, boilerplate is what we call it, structure. And that structure is what I'm going to put on the screen right here. This is going to be the most basic way to write an HTML document. Now, everything within those HTML tags, we call these tags, is going to define the whole document. And then within that document, you have a head tag, which has a site title. So if you look up into the browser tab, the name that you see within that browser tab is defined by that title within the head. And then there's other things that go in the head of the HTML document, some things like different style sheets, meta tags, all that kind of stuff that we're not going to get too much in detail with in this lesson. Now, what we're going to be focusing on is everything within that body tag. So that's going to represent the bulk of your HTML document, and it's going to represent the stuff that you're actually seeing on that web page. Well, the thing that I have up on the screen right now is going to represent the most basic form of an HTML document. There is a more standard boilerplate that you're probably going to see. So I'm going to put that up right now. So this boilerplate HTML document pretty much has everything that you need to learn in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'm not going to go through absolutely everything that you're seeing here, but I do want to cover a few things that are very important. We're not going to actually get into writing these, but if you'll notice, you see within the head, you see this link tag, and you'll see that it references something called a style sheet, and then it gives a file that is passed in. So this is actually called a CSS document, and that's going to be fed into the HTML to actually style it. If you look further down in this document, you're going to see a script tag, which represents the JavaScript that is connected to the HTML and gives it function. Now, in our case, we're going to be working in an environment called CodePen. So what I've got up on the screen is a basic CodePen document. I suggest that you create an account. It's free, and you'll be using it throughout this specific lesson on HTML. So if you look on the left side, you see HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, going back to that boilerplate that I just showed on the screen, this is basically a beginner-friendly way to write that. So CodePen has already taken care of connecting everything up, so the CSS and the JavaScript are automatically connected to the HTML. And within this HTML area, this is actually going to be what we're filling in to the body. So you know how I talked about there's the whole HTML document, and then you have the head and the body. Well, this represents the body, and you can just assume that CSS and JavaScript are all connected up and ready to go with this. I'm going to be using this CodePen playground because it's going to be a very user-friendly way to explain what HTML is all about. Later in the series, we'll talk about writing our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in our own local environment, but as we've been doing with the JavaScript earlier in the series using the browser DevTools console, this is kind of the same deal. We're going to just get into an environment that's easy to use right off the bat. Like I said, HTML represents hypertext markup language, and it only has a few key things that you have to understand about it. What we're going to be focusing on a lot in this HTML crash course are two things. So number one, we are going to be talking about HTML tags. And number two, we're going to be talking about HTML attributes. So what do I mean by those? Well, let's take a look at this code pen, and you'll see that we can write a basic HTML tag by using these little brackets here. So this happens to be a paragraph tag represented by P, and within it you have these little brackets here. So the tag itself is enclosed in the brackets, and then between it, this is where we put some text that we want to display in the browser. And you'll see that once it renders, we have some text displaying within the CodePen browser. All right, so the end of this is going to be what we call the closing tag, and you'll notice that we have this / before the tag itself. So I'm going to put up on the screen a basic diagram that gives you the anatomy of an HTML element. So if we're breaking it down, you basically have an opening tag, then you have one or more attributes that you have defined for that specific element. Then you have the content that you put within the element, which can be just text, or it can be other HTML elements in certain cases. We'll talk about that in a second. And then finally, you close it off with a closing HTML tag. So you might be wondering, what is this whole attribute thing about? You'll see, in that diagram that I put up, we've got a class attribute, which just happens to be one of many attributes that we can define for an HTML element. In this case, the attribute we're talking about is a class attribute. We're going to talk more about the different types you can use, but in this case, a class attribute directly relates to kind of identifying the element with CSS. Now, we're not going to be talking a whole lot about CSS in this lesson, but I do want to show you just the basics of what this attribute is doing. So we might say some class defined within this class attribute, and then we can come down into the CSS and define that, and then we can maybe give it a different color, and now the text up here is going to be red. So that's what we're doing with this attribute, but that doesn't mean that all attributes relate to CSS. We also can have attributes that are totally unrelated to CSS. So for example, if we wanted to add an image tag here, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, so don't worry about the syntax here yet, we can define something called a source attribute. So this source attribute is going to actually give us the image URL that we want to display within that image tag. So let me get an image to put in there real quick and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so I'm going to put a dog image in here just as I normally do, so we'll paste that in there. And now you should see, once it reloads, a very large picture here. So we're going to use another attribute that I just know from experience about. We can put a width property on here and maybe define it to about 300 pixels so that it's much smaller and we can see the image. All right, so again, you should not understand, the P tag and the image tag. You don't need to understand that quite yet. We're going to cover it in a second. But what I want to demonstrate here is that these attributes can, serve a lot of different purposes. And they're ultimately the same thing. Like, you can think about them just like JavaScript variables. So just like we're defining some sort of, variable here or attribute, and then assigning it some value, you can do the same thing in JavaScript. So you could define an attribute and give it some value here, and that's the variable, the JavaScript variable that we are so used to working with from the previous lessons. So it's kind of a similar concept, but these, what we call variables or attributes here are specific to these HTML elements that we are creating. All right, before we get any further into these details that you're not understanding quite yet, I want to talk about the difference between an element, so an HTML element, and an HTML tag. So when I think of an element, I think of it as a complete unit. So it not only has an HTML tag, but it also might have some attributes or maybe even some event listeners. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. So let me write out a full element real quick, just like we saw a second ago. So we'll say a paragraph element, and then we'll close it off with our closing brackets. So I think of this as a complete unit, and a full HTML element. And we can also add on some attributes. So maybe an ID is going to be P1 or something, and then we can add a class attribute. Now, it doesn't matter what attributes you're putting here. I'm just trying to demonstrate this is a full HTML element. Now, if we're talking about tags, I like to think of those as the actual indicator for what type of element we're creating. So in this case, we're going to put a P tag indicated by the letter P right here. So as we move forward, think of the tag as the function, or like what the element is supposed to be doing, and then the whole element as a general structure of that HTML. The next thing I want to talk about is the types of HTML tags that we can use. So far we just looked at a paragraph tag and an image tag, but there are obviously plenty more that we can use within our HTML documents. So the first type of tag, at least how I categorize it, there's plenty more classifications that you'll find with official documentation, but just for our brains to understand it, I think we can think about this in terms of normal HTML elements and self-closing HTML elements, or maybe tags would be a better way to say that. So let me paste in a few of them here. These are all, different tags that we can use. So the P tag, the H1 tag, div, span, and strong. And all of these are what we consider kind of normal HTML tags because they have an opening tag right here and then a closing tag, and then you put something in the middle of them to actually create the entire element. So these are what we consider normal. Now there are some other HTML tags that have some different behaviors where they're actually called self-closing. And I'm going to paste a few of those within our code pen here. So let's get rid of these. And now we're looking at self-closing tags. And this would be image, input, meta tags. These go in the head of the HTML document. Link tags. This is how we link up the style sheets to our HTML. Something that's going on behind the scenes here. So these are self-closing, which basically means we have everything we need within this single tag, and we put this / at the end of it. So rather than doing this, let me just give you a very specific example here. So rather than saying image and then having a closing tag and then putting something between them, that's not valid. We just have to create one tag right here called image and then put the / at the end of it to close it. So these are the two types of tags that we're dealing with. You'll start to recognize them as you get more experience writing HTML. I'll be sure to point them out as we go. Now, the reason that I talk about the difference between normal and self-closing tags is they have different behaviors. So if you wanted to embed some content within a normal element, so let's take a div element, which I just think of as kind of a general purpose container that we can use in HTML. And I can put some text in here. It's going to work just fine, as you see on the screen. I can also enter down and put in another HTML element, maybe a paragraph tag here, and I can embed HTML within that div tag. All right, so that's a normal HTML element that has an opening and closing tag. But if we tried to do this with something like an image tag, all right, so this is a valid way to write an image, and we of course need a source attribute. So let me see if I can get another image here. Okay, so let me get an actual image in here so that this is a valid image tag. All right, so it's working on the right. But what I want to show you is that if you try to put something within this tag, so let's come right here and try to put maybe a P element in here. and we'll put some text right there, you're going to see that this is not going to work all that well. So you'll see these weird brackets here at the end, and while the overall image is working and you still see some text printed to the screen, this is not valid HTML to write. This is, it'll render, but it's not valid. So just remember, as we write these self-closing HTML elements, you can't put anything within them. Now, a more subtle difference that I want to point out, within these elements that we call normal, or the tags that we call normal. So, for example, a paragraph tag, we've got some text that we can put in there. Now, we can also put stuff within this, but does it make sense to do so? And the answer is probably not. So if we have a paragraph tag and we put some text in here, and then we also try to put maybe another paragraph tag, so we'll put some more text in there, this does not make a lot of sense to me, and it doesn't make sense in general when you're writing HTML, because in general, a tag such as the paragraph tag is not meant to have elements embedded between it other than just plain text. So there are some HTML elements that have these kind of container functionalities, and then there are some elements that just are meant to store text and only text. So while we don't want to put, elements within a paragraph tag, if we just change this to a div, that's going to be more appropriate. So we can put, as many other elements within a div as we want to, because it's kind of structured and meant to do something like that. It's kind of meant to be a more of a container type HTML tag. All right, so we've gone through some of the nuances of what type of HTML tags you're going to be looking at. Now in this next section, I want to actually walk through some of the most common ones that you'll see and you'll use. Not only that, but I want to show you how to actually inspect your HTML in the browser, and also how do we look these different tags up in our documentation. If you don't know what something is, or you don't know what it's supposed to be used for, you can go to the documentation to figure it out. Like I said, there are a ton of HTML tags that you can use, and I'm not going to be covering, even half of them here. That's not the goal. The goal here is to get you the most essential ones and help you understand how to find and use different tags without having prior knowledge of them. As we talked about earlier, HTML is not styled. It's all about structure. So if you look at this page I've got pulled up on the screen, you can see a bunch of really ugly web elements. And we're going to walk through each of these very briefly just so that you can kind of get the gist of them. And I'll show you, for a couple of them, how we actually look them up in the documentation and see what they're for. So just as a preview, we've got some content elements up here. We've got headings, paragraph tags. Then we come down into some more content elements. So we have span elements, which allow you to kind of custom style. This actually has some CSS within it, which we're not covering, but you can see how you can do things with the paragraph tags and make it a little bit more customized using span and EM and strong elements. And then we can also use images and links. So A would be a link, image, and then buttons here. So we got buttons, and then we have some list, and then finally tables. Like I said, we're not going to be covering that a whole lot. But this is just the landscape of most of the elements that you'll be using on a daily basis as a web developer. But before we jump into that, I want to show you exactly how we inspect these. Now you'll notice I jumped over to Google Chrome here. I'm using that for a very specific reason that we'll kind of talk about a little bit later in this lesson. But it's very similar to Firefox. All you have to do is right click and click inspect. And then from here, if you rearrange this, you'll see that the elements panel is where you can actually see the HTML within this document. So if we click down on the body, you can see all of these elements, and every time we hover over them, it will actually highlight it in the browser itself. All right, so you can scroll down and just basically see the source of this HTML document, which is a great way to understand it. Now I also have this exact document linked in a CodePen pen. You can find that in the materials in the description of this video, so you can just look through this on your own time if I go through something a little bit too fast here. All right, the first ones we're going to be talking about, the first HTML tags are heading tags. So that is H1 through H6. Now, if we go to the documentation, I'm going to just go through this exercise with you so that you can get used to doing this. But we basically go to MDN, we go to Technologies and click HTML, and then we can go down to the references and click the HTML elements. From here, we can obviously go through and look for all these different tags that we can use, and in this case, we want the headings. So I'll click H1, and you can see that it just has one page for H1 through H6 because they're all so similar types of elements. When you're on a documentation page, it's good to read this first sentence here, just glance at the demo. But if you come down to usage notes, this is where you're going to learn, like, what is this tag actually for? You know, as we talked about, HTML is the structure of the web, and therefore every tag that we're using has a very specific purpose. So this one says heading information can be used by user agents to construct a table of contents for a document automatically. All right, so basically what that's saying for us is that we can use the H1 through H6 to organize our web pages. So let's start with an H1 element, all right, and we can give it a page title. All right, so that's kind of what H1 is used for. When you go onto a web page, there's always going to be a title of that, blog post, article, or just the page in general, and usually it's going to be H1. That's what Google searches for with the search engines. So a lot of SEOs will, recommend that you have this semantically laid out so that the H1 only occurs once on the page, and then you have everything else as H2 or even smaller. So we'll make some H2s here. This will be a secondary heading. And like I said, this is going to lay out your document semantically based on the order of importance of your text. So I think you probably get the point of this. You can do this for H3 all the way to H6. Not all that complicated. So we're going to just stop it right here. But you kind of get the point. Play around with this, and basically all I'll say about this is that H1 through H3 is probably the furthest you're going to go. You might use an H4 every once in a while, but generally those first three are sufficient to build a web page. Next up, we have the paragraph tag, which we've already used a little bit. So if we come to the MDN documentation and we go back to let me just go through the full process so we get used to it. So technologies, HTML elements, and then we can scroll down and look for the relevant tag. So we'll come all the way down here to the P tag. So it says the HTML P element represents a paragraph. Paragraphs are usually represented in visual media as blocks of text separated from adjacent blocks, blah, blah, blah. Bunch of jargon here that we don't really need to read too much about. This is basically what you're going to see everywhere on the web. So when you read an article, a blog post, most of the text is going to be a paragraph element, and it's very simple to write, as we saw. We can just put some text between the opening and closing tags, and you've got yourself a paragraph element. Now, while we're here, I want to highlight something kind of important with HTML, and there are actually two things. So number one, HTML is not case sensitive. So if we wanted to capitalize one of these tags and then have lowercase tags over here on the end, it's still going to work just fine because HTML doesn't care about capitalization. Now, it also does not care about line breaks. So if we had a couple elements here, let's just make a couple paragraph tags, and we put a bunch of spaces in here and we entered it down a bunch. Let's make some enter down and some more spaces. You'll see that the output is going to be the same no matter what. And that's because the spaces between the tags doesn't matter whatsoever. Basically, when it's rendered in the web or in the browser, it's just looking for the opening and closing tag, and then it automatically knows how to lay that out on the page. So it's not case sensitive, and these line breaks and spaces do not matter between these elements. All right, with that said, we're moving on to the next elements, and that would be some other content elements that allow you to basically style your paragraphs. But I will say that as we talk about semantic HTML, the whole goal of the new HTML5 standard, which is the latest spec, similar to when we talked about JavaScript in previous lessons, how there's the ECMAScript standard and ES6, all that kind of stuff. Well, there's also an HTML spec that is supposed to be followed. And in the latest one, the goal is to basically use HTML for structure and function only. So instead of using HTML to actually style elements, you're supposed to use only CSS to do that. That said, you will see these tags I'm about to show you quite often in old code, and people still use them. So you need to know what they are and what they do. So let's write a paragraph tag right here. Some text that I want to emphasize and make bold and styled. All right, so these words are going to be manipulated by other HTML elements. And as I said earlier, a p tag is generally not something you want to embed other HTML elements within. So like I said, you probably do not want to put another p tag within a p tag and put text in there. But there are a couple exceptions, and they relate to the strong, emphasis, and span elements. So the first one we'll look at is going to be span. So let's go ahead, go back to the documentation, go back to this reference, and look for the span tag. Okay, so we'll click span, and it says this element is a generic inline container for phrasing content which does not inherently represent anything. It can be used to group elements for styling purposes or because they share attribute values, so on and so forth. So basically what that is saying is if you want something, an HTML element that's not going to break down to a new line, it's just going to be in line with the rest of the text, but you want it to look a little bit different or function a little bit different than the rest of it, you might use a span tag. So an example of that, we'll wrap this last word, styled, within a span tag. All right, and as of right now, you see that it is red. The reason this is red is because behind the scenes, I didn't tell you this, but I wrote some CSS that will take any span element and turn it the color red using CSS. So if I open this up, you'll see that I said for every span element, I want the color to be red. Now, I don't expect you to understand what that CSS is saying yet. We're going to cover that in the next lesson. But basically, that's the point of a span, is you can take a single, piece of text within a paragraph tag, and you can emphasize it in whatever way you want using CSS. Similar to a span, we also have the strong and EM, or emphasize, tags. So let's take a look at those in the documentation. Let's go to the EM tag. This is, it marks text that has emphasis. So basically italics is what it's saying. And then if we go to the strong tag down here, this indicates that its contents have strong importance, seriousness, or urgency, which is another way of saying bold. So like I said, this in the new HTML standard, you probably should not use these tags, but I'm showing you them because you'll see them often, people still use them, and they are valid HTML. So if I wanted to emphasize this word, or in other words, make it italic, I can surround it with these, with this EM tag. And you'll see that this one word is now italicized. Now we can also make a word bold by wrapping it with the strong tag. And now this will be a bold word. So as you can see, we can use these different HTML elements to actually style our HTML, but again, not recommended. I would go ahead and use the best practices and style these with CSS instead. And I know you're probably wondering what the heck that means. And basically all that means is instead of using the EM tag, we might put in a span here for the emphasis. All right, and now that this is wrapped in a span, we can change the CSS. So right now it's just making everything the color red, But if we wanted to put an attribute in each of these, so we'll put a class and we'll say red color. So for this span, it's going to be a red color. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And then for this span, we'll put an attribute in there, or a class, called italics. All right. And now we can come down in the CSS. Let me delete all of this. So down here in the CSS, I can basically look at elements that have these specific classes. Again, I'm sorry for getting too much into this, but I really want to show you what I mean when I say you should style it with CSS rather than the EM and strong tags. So what we can do is we can select that class in CSS, and then we can basically say the font style should be italic. All right, and once we do that, you'll see that this word is emphasized with italics again, but this time instead of using the EM element, we're using a span with some CSS styles. Now we can also come down and select the red color class and just give it a color equal to red. And now you can see that we're back to the original style that we had. So again, we're not covering CSS too much in this lesson, but I do want to show you how it's working with the HTML in unison. All right, so the next elements that we got to talk about, I think a big one is going to be the div element. Now this is going to be one that you use all the time, and it's very important, and I consider it to be just a general container element. But let's look it up in the documentation, and there's our div tag. All right, so this is called an HTML content division element, and it's a generic container for flow content. So like I said, it's just like a generic container that we can basically separate out pieces of our HTML. And you know, the most important thing about it is we can take each of these individual units that are within a specific div, and then we can style it. So very similar to that span element where we're taking a individual piece of text and we're making it look different than the others. We can also use some CSS magic along with this HTML structure to separate out our content. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say that we have two div containers, all right, and then within these we have some elements in container 1, all right, and we'll just make a bunch of those, and then we'll do the same thing for elements within container 2. So right now on the screen, these don't look separated at all. You know, you basically look at this and say like, oh, it's all just one big piece together. But since we wrapped these within div elements, we can actually put some styles on here to separate them out. And like I said, you're not going to understand how these styles are working quite yet. We'll do that in the next lesson, but I do want to show you how the div is able to separate out our content. So the first one we need to identify by div1, just an arbitrary class name that we're giving it, and then div2. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to make some boxes around these. So all we have to do is select both of them and give them a border. All right, and from here you can see that now we're getting some separation of our HTML elements. And we can even put some margin around there. And now it's going to be very apparent that we have two very separate sections of our HTML document. And that is the power of a div, and you'll be using these div elements to section out your content all the time. The next element we're going to talk about, or not element, but tag, is going to be the A tag, which represents a link in HTML. Let's take a look in the documentation. Again, just as a recap, technologies, HTML, HTML elements, and then you can click A. So this is actually called the anchor element. That's what A stands for. And it says, with its href attribute, creates a hyperlink to web pages, files, email addresses, locations on the same page, or anything else a URL can address. All right, so an anchor tag or a link tag is going to require this single attribute called the href attribute. Now, with HTML tags, most of them do not have required attributes, but with a couple of them, there are some required attributes. This happens to be one of them. So if we were to come into our HTML as we have it here, and maybe we wanted to make a link around some of these text. So what I'm going to do is make an A tag surrounded by this first container 1 text. And right now you'll see that nothing is happening over here. When I click it, there's nothing there. But once I put in that href attribute and I put in a link, so we'll say www.google.com, now you'll see that we have this link styling, and if we click this, it should take us to the appropriate link. Now, one weird thing about CodePen, since it's kind of like an integrated environment that we can write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, when you have link tags within a CodePen, you can't click on them and actually go outside of CodePen. So I've actually pulled up, let's actually look at the local file that I have. So this is what I was showing you, how to navigate around the different elements. And if we go down to where I have the link example right here, so let's go ahead and click this button up here to select a specific element, and then I can click on that and it takes me there on the right side. And you can see that I have this A or anchor tag with the href attribute right here representing my personal website. All right, so when I click this, it's going to take me directly to my website. And that's how an anchor element is going to work. Now there's one additional thing that we can add to an anchor element to affect the behavior of the link. So if we were to go in here, and we can actually edit HTML directly within the DevTools, and if we put a attribute called target, and then we give it an underscore blank value, so if we were to go to the documentation to see this, you'll see that there's a couple attributes available here, href being one of them. But if you go down, you can see there's a target attribute, and it gives you the possible values that you can put in there, and it says where to display the linked URL as a name for a browsing context. So basically it's saying, where do I need to open this link? And if we go to blank, it says usually a new tab. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Once I put in this target equals blank and I click this link, it's opening a brand new tab rather than taking me to that link within the current tab. Like I said, there's other attributes on an anchor element, but those are probably the most common two ones that you'll need. And the href attribute is actually required to make it function as a link at all. The next one we're covering is the input element, and this one is loaded with functionality, especially when you start putting it within a form element. All right, so we're not going to talk a whole lot about this because this comes later in this series, and we're going to talk a lot about it in the context of a front-end web framework like React or Angular or Vue.js. But I just want to introduce it to you. So we'll go to input tag. We got to go back on the documentation. It actually has an entire section just for input types. And like I said, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to do with forms within the web. So let's open up the normal HTML reference and go down and find the input. All right, so we'll click input. And it says it's used to create interactive controls for web-based forms in order to accept data from a user. And that's pretty much where we're going to stop because that's all that we need to know for now. I'm just going to show you a couple basic attributes that you can use with this and just give you the general concept of what it is. So let's go to the page we're working with here, and let me just clear out everything and put an input tag. Now this is going to be a self-closing tag. We talked about that earlier, just like an image tag is. And within this input, you'll see that we already have something showing up here on the right that we can type some text into. So right off the bat, it's usable, but if we just left it like this and we tried to hook up some JavaScript to it, it'd be very difficult to select it and grab the data that the user's typing in from it. So something that we'll often do is give an input a name. And this is very important when you put this within a form so it can identify which input it needs to grab data from. So we'll just say this will be input 1. And then another thing that you can put, another attribute you can put is going to be a placeholder. And this placeholder is going to be whatever shows up in kind of a grayed out text to indicate to the user what they need to type. So we can say enter email address here, and you'll see that this placeholder gets put in there, and then once you start typing, it goes away. So that's a very common element or attribute that you can use for the input tag. Now you can also put a predefined value in there. So instead of a placeholder, if we were to put value, it's going to replace that placeholder with an actual value. So you can see how there's text already in here, and if you wanted to change it, you'd have to delete it and then type some new text. So those are some of the common attributes that you can use for inputs. And again, I'm not going to cover inputs in very much detail at all right now because we're going to talk about them a lot later in the series. Next up, we're going to be talking about image tags, and we've already looked at it a little bit. So let's go to our HTML, elements reference, and then look for the image tag. There it is. All right, so the image element embeds an image into the document. All right, and there's going to be a couple common attributes that you'll use for this, and there's one that is required. So the source attribute is required, as you can see in the documentation, and then the alt attribute is highly recommended. So when we're talking about web accessibility and we're talking about, how do we know what this image represents if it doesn't render correctly, that's going to be what the alt attribute does. So I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about here. Let's write our image tag, which is self-closing. And then from here, we're not going to see anything because we don't have our required source attribute. Now let's go back to this dog photo. We'll put in the source attribute and paste in the link to that photo. And it's of course going to be very large here because the image is much larger than our page here. But we can also add in an additional attribute. And a quick tip with HTML, you can actually enter these down so it doesn't have to all be on one line. We can separate out the different attributes from the tags. So we'll go with source first, and then we'll put in another common one, which will be width. So you can also specify this within CSS, but this would be a quick way to make the width of this image 300 pixels. All right, so that gives us a more manageable image to work with. And then finally, we have the alt attribute. So we'll say a dog image or something like that to describe what our image is all about. And the reason we use this is because if our link is broken, so if I just break the link real quick, you're going to see when it reloads that it's going to give this little image icon, and then whatever we put in the alt attribute, it'll say a dog image. So if the link ever breaks, the user will know like, oh, this is supposed to be a dog image, and I kind of know what the context of this image is. And then finally, one of my favorite content elements is going to be button. All right, so this is what we get to click and do fun things with. So how we write this is we just basically write out button. It's a normal, opening and closing tag type of element. Let's take a look in the documentation real quick. Go to HTML elements and we'll find the button element. It says it represents a clickable button used to submit forms or anywhere in a document for accessible standard button functionality. All right, so we click buttons all the time when we use web apps, and it basically brings our web apps to life. It allows the user to know like, okay, I got to click this to do something. So within our button, we can give it some text. So we might say click me in all caps. And you'll see that now we have a button that we can click. Now it's not going to do anything right off the bat because we haven't hooked up any event listeners or stuff like that to it. Now there's really not any common attributes that you'll see on a button like this, but there is one common thing that you'll have to have for a button for it to really do anything, and that is a event listener. Now, we're not quite ready to talk about events within HTML, but I do want to quickly show you what I'm talking about with buttons. So if I wanted to do something every time someone clicked on this button, I have to assign it an on-click event. Now this is built in. This is actually not an attribute. This is an event listener. So in here, it expects a specific function to be called every time we click this button. All right, so if I go down to the JavaScript section of this code pen and I define a basic function that says alert me. All right, so something like this, where every time we click the button, it's going to bring up an alert in the browser, and it's going to say hi. All right, so very simple. And now if we put that into the button right here, and we click the button, it's going to make an alert pop up and say hi every time we click it. All right, so that's just the basics of event handling within HTML, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get into the concept of the document object model, or the DOM. The next element I want to talk about is another content element, and it's a list. So with a list, we can basically have bullet points, or we can have numbered list. All right, so if we wanted to have a bullet point list, we're going to use some tag called UL. All right, so what UL stands for is unordered list, and if we go to the documentation here, we should be able to see that somewhere. So let's go down to the HTML elements and find UL. All right, so there is the UL, and it's going to say this represents an unordered list of items typically rendered as a bulleted list. All right, so that's basically what that stands for, and within it we have to put some LI tags. So you can see if we click LI, this element is used to represent an item in a list. All right, so we can put that here. So we'll say LI and we'll say item 1, and then we can copy this down a couple of times and give it item 2 and 3. And now you can see on the right side we have a bulleted list of content. All right, and if we wanted to change this to a numbered list, all we have to do is change the UL kind of container to an OL container. And you can see it changed here on the bottom automatically, and now you can see that it is numbered. And if we go to the documentation, we should be able to click on OL to see that this represents an ordered list of items. All right, so those are the two types of list, and these will be very helpful to us when we're laying out content, and oftentimes you'll see these lists corresponding to a loop. So if we talked about in JavaScript earlier how loops work, and we can take an array of elements and we can loop through them, well, it makes sense that we could basically loop through an array of elements and display them in a list like this. So just keep that in mind as we move forward in the series. And then the last thing I want to cover is tables, and I know I said at the beginning we're not going to be talking about this all that often, but I want to just glance over it very quickly, and I recommend that you look at this on your own if you want more details about it. So if we go to the documentation once again, we go down to HTML elements and table. All right, so we'll click table, and it says represents tabular data, and then it shows you the basic structure of a table. You can see that we have the table as the main container, and then we have the t-head tag will be the header tags, and then the t-body will be whatever data we're putting within our table. Within that body, we have tr tags, which are going to be the rows, and then within the tr tags, we have table data, for which we'll put td tags in there. All right, so as you can see, it's a pretty complex structure, and like I said, I recommend just using a table generator. You can just search for it on Google. It's much easier than trying to remember this structure. Now, of course, you could look it up and just copy in this example and get started that way too. Anyways, let's move on to the next part of our lesson, and that's going to be talking about HTML attributes in a little bit more detail. In this next part of the HTML crash course, we're going to be talking about the HTML attributes. Now, I know it's probably been a little bit confusing so far. We've gone through a bunch of different HTML tags that we can be using. We briefly covered attributes and how they work, but we didn't really talk about when do you use them, how do you know when to use them, what's fair game here. So we're going to start by talking about the difference between a global attribute and an element-specific attribute. In short, a global attribute is something that's available to any HTML element, no matter what it is. An element-specific attribute is an attribute that only does something to elements that it applies to. So a good example of this can be the image tag. So let's go ahead and look at that on the screen real quick. So if we make an image tag and we give it a source property and then we give it a class, or not property, but attribute, you can see the difference between a global and an element specific one. So again, let's go ahead and put the source in there, and then let's make the width equal to 300 like we did earlier. And what you can see on this image tag, and then the total HTML element that we call an image, you can see that we have the source attribute, which is specific to this image tag. We also have the width attribute, which is also specific to the image tag. Now, the class attribute is a global attribute, which means it can be used on any element or any tag. And to show that, let's go ahead and make a paragraph tag below. We'll put some text in there, and then we'll give it a class. All right, so we've given it a class here, and you can see that it's not doing anything right now, but if we were to actually style these two different elements, we would use these class values as a way to select them within our CSS. So as I kind of showed you earlier, you can actually select these different classes and basically put some styles on here. So what if I wanted to put a border on this image? We can do it like that. We can make that border a little bit larger. And you can see how we can style that. Or we can come down and select the other one, so some class value, and we can give this text a different color. So maybe we'll call it green. And so now we can see that the text is green. But this is not a CSS tutorial. I just wanted to show you that that is a global attribute that we can use to connect up our HTML and our CSS. But if I came down here and put something like a width on the P element, and I gave it maybe 20 px or something like that, it's not going to actually do anything because this is not applicable to the paragraph tag. And likewise, if we put a source on here and then we copied in the image URL, it's not going to do anything either because this is a paragraph tag. It doesn't have a source attribute. So it'll still render in the browser okay, it just won't do anything. And that's the difference between a global and an element-specific attribute. If you wanted to connect the dots with the previous lessons we've gone through, you can think of these element-specific attributes just like we have JavaScript methods. So if you remember, if we have a string like this, there are a certain number of methods that are available to this string data type and certain methods that are not. So for example, if we wanted to call a method like string.toUppercase, all right, something like that, that's going to work just fine. And I'm actually going to come over to a console that we can use to show this. So we got a string, all right, right here, and then if we say string to uppercase, it's going to work just fine. It's going to make all of the letters uppercase. But if we said string.reverse, it's going to say type error because reverse is a method that's only available to an array data type. So we would need an array like this and then use array.reverse to actually use that method. And the same thing applies to HTML attributes. There are just certain attributes that only apply to certain tag types. All right, at this point, we have covered quite a lot about HTML. And I want to have you actually go through a practice exercise and a challenge to reinforce some of these concepts so that when we talk about some how we actually connect JavaScript to the HTML, you're not still trying to figure out like how does HTML work. So I'm going to give you this challenge. If we go to my code pen, let's see if we can open this up here. All right, so as you can see, this is the challenge that we're going to be working with. And what I've done here is I've put a couple different HTML elements, and your goal is to basically recreate this, but put in your own personal details, of course, and something that you can share maybe on Twitter. Use the 100 Days of Code hashtag. Maybe hit me up, ZG_dev. But anyways, we're going to be building something like this, but personalized. And I've given you a starter template. So this will be linked to in the description below. So be sure to check that out, and you'll just open this starter challenge up, and you'll see that within the HTML, I've kind of laid out a basic template for you. And it says your code goes here. Now, within CodePen, this HTML part, as I talked about a little bit earlier, represents the body part. So really, all we have to do is just start typing right here. So I'll leave you with that, and you can just start typing some HTML. So you can put some text in there, and you're going to see that it automatically shows up on the screen. And furthermore, it's going to be styled just like the one that I showed you, because I've already written some CSS styles that will basically apply to your HTML, no matter how you use it. So I recommend that you just browse through these styles, but don't worry about how they work. Just focus on writing the HTML that is necessary to create something that looks like this. So just a few hints as we go through. This looks like some sort of heading. We've got some paragraphs in here. We've got a link. We've got a list. And then we've got an image down here. So that's basically all you need to do. So go ahead and try that challenge out, and be sure to share your results on Twitter. The next part of this video, we are talking about something called the DOM. And that stands for Document Object Model. And it's very closely related to HTML, which we talked about in the previous part of this lesson. Now, I will say, if you have not completed the challenge that I gave in the prior video, go ahead and complete that. And I would recommend that you have at least a basic understanding of HTML and kind of understand how to put something together within, a CodePen document or something like that. Because if you don't have at least a basic level of understanding of HTML, this stuff is not going to make any sense. Before we get into this, I want to show you a little bit about the CodePen environment so that we can understand how do we actually debug JavaScript within the browser, and take those concepts we've been looking at in the prior videos where we've pretty much right-clicked. So let's take a look at the screen here. If we right-click and inspect, and then we come to the console, then we can write basic JavaScript within the console. So we've been working in the console quite a bit. But when we go to CodePen, since it's kind of its own environment, we have to do a few things to make sure that that console is working the same. So if we come down to the JS section of the CodePen, this is a little bit different than what we've been working with in the console. Now, if we were to just type something like, console.log hello, now this is going to be printed to the console, but it's going to do it over and over again every time the page loads, because this JavaScript that we're working with here is directly connected to the HTML document above. So it's not really like a free-form console that we can use to test out different JavaScript. Now, CodePen does have a console down here at the bottom left, and if you open it up, you'll see that we have that hello that we printed by writing that JavaScript code. But we can also do something like that down here in the console, and this is supposed to represent the same type of thing that we've been working with when we right-click and inspect and go to the DevTools console. But the problem is this is not a really nice and easy console to work with. Like if you started to, define a variable that's like a string or something, and then you type A, and you hit enter, it's not going to be defined. And that's a problem, because we want to be able to experiment around and work with our JavaScript as we're building it. So to solve that problem, we're not going to be using the CodePen console. What we're going to do is right-click and inspect within the CodePen document, so it still opens up this console. And I will note I'm in Google Chrome, not Firefox. This does not work quite as well in Firefox, unfortunately. So I've switched to Chrome for that reason. And if we go to the console, you'll see some of the hellos that we put there from earlier. But if you go to this little drop down here, when we first enter the document, you might see something like top. But in order to get the right context to work in, you have to drop this down and scroll down to CodePen. Now we can actually select elements from the CodePen document that we've written here, and we don't have to, or we're basically going to have some responsiveness with our JavaScript. Just to quickly show you this, and we're going to cover all of this stuff in a little bit, but let me put a basic paragraph tag in our CodePen document, and you can see it showing up there. And if we have this context, the JavaScript context set to top, and we try to type document.query selector and then grab all the paragraph tags, it's not going to grab us the right ones. So this is a paragraph tag, but it's not the one that we're looking for here. So we have to go down to the right context, so select CodePen, and now when we run this, it should give us the correct element that we're looking for. So that's just really important. If you're trying to follow along with this, like code along as I'm doing it, just make sure that you're in Google Chrome, you right-click Inspect Element, and make sure that the context is the right one. It's under the CodePen context. All right, now we got that covered. Just want to make sure that you're able to follow along. Let's jump into what the document object model, or the DOM, is all about. Now, how I would describe the DOM is a bridge between HTML and JavaScript. Prior to these lessons, we've been going through how to write JavaScript code. We've gone through all the basics of it, so you have at least a basic level of understanding of how to write JavaScript. We also just learned about the basics of HTML, which, as you saw, is a lot easier to learn than JavaScript. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take these two concepts and we're going to combine them together to make our HTML come alive. So remember, with the house analogy, HTML is the structure, CSS is the styling, and JavaScript is the function. So in other words, with the house analogy, HTML is the bricks and the concrete and the wood, the CSS is the paint on the house, and the JavaScript is going to be the plumbing and the electric and all that kind of stuff. Now, the first question you're going to ask is, why are we looking at the DOM in the first place? How do we know that this is important? Well, the DOM is basically at the root of any front-end framework that you're ever going to work in. It's the only way that we can connect our JavaScript to HTML, and while you may not see it directly, it may kind of, be doing a bunch of stuff behind the scenes when you're working with a framework like Angular, React, or Vue.js. It's still there. It's still using the DOM API. We're going to talk about that in a second. So it's important to know that it exists and know the basics of how it works and what it's trying to accomplish. So what is the DOM? Now, we know it's the document object model, which gives us a little bit of a clue what we're talking about here, but it's a little bit more complex than just that. Now, I'll start with what it is not. So the DOM is not a programming language. It's also not natively part of JavaScript. So it only exists within the browser, and there's different browser implementations, whether you're on Firefox or Chrome or Safari. They all have slightly different implementations of the DOM. For our intents and purposes, we don't really care about those differences. We just want to know, what it is and how it works. So the best way to think about the DOM is an API for an HTML document. Now, you may not know what an API is, but luckily I have done a video on just that. So go ahead and watch that if you're unclear of what an API is. But just as a 10,000-foot view, what I consider an API, and this is my personal definition of it that makes sense in my head, is a software API can be thought of as a user manual that allows developers to do something useful with a third-party software or hardware without knowing the inner workings of that software or hardware. So basically, the API that we call the DOM is going to allow us to manipulate HTML without knowing, how is HTML actually, manipulated within the browser. All we have to know is how to write the HTML and then how to use the API that we call the DOM to manipulate it. I know your head's probably spinning at this point, so let's jump into a simple example to understand what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do here is paste in some HTML, all right? So this is going to be a basic HTML document. I've got an H2 tag, a paragraph tag, and a button. Now, if we click this button, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, when we click this button, it's not going to do anything. And the reason is we don't have any JavaScript connected up to it. In order to connect it up, All we have to do is first identify the element that we're wanting to make interactive, and then once we identify it, we need to instruct it to do something via JavaScript. So just as an example, we can identify this button using pure JavaScript. And all we have to do is type document.querySelector, and then we type in button because that's the tag that we're looking for. Now, of course, I need to select the correct context to work in. So we want the CodePen context. And then from here, when we press enter, we're going to see the button that is within our CodePen output. All right, so that's how we would select that button. Now, from there, we can actually store that within a variable. So if we were to rewrite that command and then just store it in a basic variable, so btn is our variable, now we can reuse it and we can do things with it. But at this point, you probably don't have any clue what all of these commands are, like what is document here, what's query selector, all of that kind of stuff. Doesn't make any sense yet because we haven't talked about the DOM. So to better understand it, I want to bring in yet another analogy for us. Now, when we think about an HTML document, just a static HTML document that we've been working with so far, so this one right here on the screen, that is kind of the equivalent to a paper map. So with a paper map, there's only so many things you can do with it. You can write on it, of course, but you're not going to be able to, click into it and see some more details about it. But we can do that with something like Google Maps. We can click in and go to different places and do a bunch of other functions with it. So the analogy here is that HTML alone is like a paper map, but when we add the DOM API with that HTML, then it becomes something like Google Maps, where we have a lot of interactivity that we can put into it. So to really talk about the document object model, let's take a look from 10,000 feet. All right, so we know some things about JavaScript that are pretty familiar to us. So for example, this is a string in JavaScript. We know that, all right? And we also know that this is going to be a number, all right? But what about that button that we just defined here? So we saved it into the button variable. So if we look at that variable, what type of data is that? Well, we don't actually have a good indication of that. All we have to do is say type of button, and it's going to say object. Well, clearly there's got to be something more specific than just object. And there is when we start using the DOM or document object model terminology. From the DOM's perspective, this element right here, or this variable right here, is considered an element. So if we were to come to the document object model documentation here, you're going to see all sorts of interfaces and stuff. It's a pretty complex API that we're not going to even cover half of. But if we click in and look at the element, this is the most general base class from which all element objects in a document inherit. All right, so that would be what we are looking at when we have saved that selected element into a variable called btn. And once we know that this is of this element type, we can come here in the documentation, we can see there's all sorts of properties that we can look at, and there's all sorts of methods that we can use on this specific variable. So we have a lot of functionality available to us, but we have to first understand, the whole 10,000 foot view. So what I'm going to do in order for us to understand it better is show you a picture that's going to represent what the DOM is really trying to do. So at its highest level, the DOM has two built-in objects that are probably going to be used more than any other objects that you look at. So at the top level, the very top level, you have the window object. And what you can think of that as is literally the browser window that we're working in. More specifically, it's kind of referring to the individual browser tab that we're working in, but in some cases it can cross over between tabs. So you can actually program using that one object. You can do all sorts of things within a browser. So as a general user of a web browser, there are several things that you do every day that you don't realize are programmable. So one of those things is scrolling down, all right? Scrolling down or scrolling up. Every time you scroll, you can actually do that programmatically with JavaScript. Now, another thing you can do is you can resize the browser window. So if you were to resize it like this, you can actually do that with JavaScript. All right, and finally, if you refresh the page, that's also something you can do with JavaScript. And the way that you do it is by connecting into the DOM via that top level object that we call window. All right, so I'm going to quickly show you how we can programmatically do these things by using that object. But first, let's take a look at this in the MDN documentation. So we'll search for window, and here's what we're looking for. And it says the window interface represents a window containing a DOM document. The document property points to the DOM document loaded in that window. So basically it's saying that the window's the browser itself, or the tab, and then there's an HTML document represented by the document object within it. All right, so that picture that I just showed you kind of shows that relationship, how we have a HTML document that we are putting in that browser window. Now from here, this window object, like I said, has all sorts of properties and methods that we can use to do things that we commonly do just by clicking around in the browser on a normal basis. So you can see down this left-hand side, these are all of the different things we can do with it. So for example, we have this alert method. So let's go ahead and inspect element. So we're in the browser console. And if we type window.alert and then we say I love programming or something like that and press enter, it's going to open up an alert window. And you can see how we're already starting to program this browser window using that object. Here's another thing we can do. We can open up new tabs. So if we say window.open and maybe go to Google, all right? When we press enter, it's going to open a new tab and put us at google.com. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, another thing that we can do is we can scroll. So you have to obviously be on a page that has a scroll bar, which this one does. And from here, we just say window scroll by, and then we give it a bunch of options here. These are all documented within this method. So if you were to go down to the methods of window, let's see if we can find them. All right, so we found the methods here. And let's see if we can find this scroll by method. All right, so we have scroll by, we can click on that, and it just tells us, okay, you can pass in some options here. And those options that we're passing in are scroll to options, all right? And then from here, we have the top, left, and behavior. So we're gonna define, we wanna scroll from the top, we wanna scroll window.innerHeight, which is going to be a built-in property of that window object, which basically says, here's how tall this entire HTML document is. All right, so from the top, we want to scroll down the entire length of the page. Essentially, we're going to the bottom of this page. All right, and then from the left, we want 0. We don't want to scroll left and right. And the behavior that we want is going to be smooth. We don't want to just jolt down the page. We want to smoothly scroll. All right, so when we do this and close out this method and press enter, you got to watch the screen now. It's going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of this, page or whatever. And I guess it didn't go all the way down because I actually explained that wrong. So window.innerHeight, if we look at that, inner height is only going to define how large the visible window is. So it's not going to define how large the entire document is. So obviously this is a much larger document. So it's only going to scroll down one entire page. And then finally, we are able to actually reload the page. So we can tap into the window.location property, and then that location property has a method called reload. And you could have found this in the documentation if you looked hard enough, but I don't want to right now just for sake of time. So let's press enter. And you can see, you may not have seen it, but it reloaded the entire page programmatically. So you can see how that top level window object is basically our control over the browser. And the way that this is happening is via the DOM API. So the DOM, again, is just an API to connect in with our browser in an HTML document. Now, another thing to mention about this is it's a global object, which means we don't have to actually specify it every time we use it. So I showed you before that we could do window.alert and then type in something to get an alert. All right, so we can also do this by dropping window. Like, we don't even need that because it's global, and we can go ahead and get the same results there. All right, so that's important to keep in mind with the window object and the document object. These are both global, so we don't need to specify them before calling their methods or properties. So a couple common properties on window. We're not going to go through all of the methods and properties for all of these objects, but this is just such a high level one, an important one, that I want to. So window has a few common properties that you might want to tap into. One of those is going to be the inner height, and I spelled that wrong, so it's not going to give me anything. So we've got inner height is going to give us the height in pixels of the space that displays the HTML. So the visible area that's displaying that HTML. Now, if we said outer height, that's going to give us the pixel height of the entire browser window. So if you look at this value, it's 1040, but if you make this browser window smaller and you say outer height, it's going to give us a different value, 894. The same thing applies for inner width and outer width. So inner width is going to give you the width of this space that's displaying the HTML. So if you resized this, you're going to get a different inner width. All right, so I don't want to spend too much time on the properties, but you can kind of get the gist of what that's showing you. Now, another common property that we might look at here with window is going to be local storage. All right, so this is going to be a big one that will come up as we start getting into more advanced web development concepts. And basically what this allows you to do is store data temporarily in the browser. So if I were to go to the application here in Chrome, it's called a little bit different thing in Firefox. I actually talked about that in like the third lesson of this series. But if you click here, you can actually see key value data pairs that can be set and retrieved through the local storage object. So if we wanted to set an item, we'll just say test, and then we want to set it equal to 20. We can do that, and then we come to application, and you can see test has a value of 20 here. So it's a great way to store temporary values, and that is accessed through the local storage object that sits on the window object. All right, and then finally, I want to talk about the location because this is going to basically represent an object that has details about where you're visiting right now. So right now we're on the MDN web docs, and if we were to look at the window.location, you're going to get all sorts of details about that location we have in the address bar. So these are some of the common properties. Just one more, two more that I want to show you here before we move on. Window has a scroll X property, which is going to indicate how much we have scrolled from the left side of the page, or I guess right and left horizontal scrolling. And then we have window.scrollY, which is going to indicate how much we've scrolled up and down. So you see the scroll bar here. This is going to change the value of this property every time we scroll a little bit. So these are all going to come in handy as we work with the DOM later on, and we want to programmatically do things within this browser window. Now, I've briefly mentioned it before, but we can have these things called events happening within the DOM. Now, this is going to be a little bit complicated, but I want to just show you a basic example of this. Something that you can do on the top level window object. So we can say window on scroll. So basically we're saying we want to tap into the on scroll event, which basically every time I move that browser scroll bar, it's going to fire this event. And what I want to do every time I scroll, I want to execute a function. So right here I'm using an anonymous function, and I'm just going to console.log hi. All right, so something very simple. And now we have set an event listener on the entire window. All right, so now when I touch this scroll bar, we're going to get this printing hi to the console for a lot of different iterations here. So that's just a basic event. Now, I just want you to know that that is available and it's something that you can do, but we're not going to really dig into the super nitty-gritty details of it in this lesson. All right, so now that we've talked about the window object, which represents the entire tab that we have open, or I guess the browser that we're working in, let's talk about the document object. So let's put that back up on the screen, that 10,000 foot view of the DOM API. We've got at the top, we've got the window object, and then a property of the window object is going to be document. And this is where the real fun begins, because document is basically a representation of your entire HTML document that you've written. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to refresh the browser so we don't have that on scroll event firing every time. But we have window at the top, and then we have this property called document. All right, so we press enter on this, and you now see that we have this big object that has basically the HTML document defined within it. And while we can expand these different things visually within the console, there's actually a lot of things that we can do programmatically using this document object. We can add or remove HTML elements from the existing page. We can modify existing HTML elements, and we can even set events on specific HTML elements. We saw how we set an event on the entire window, but we could set an event like we talked about earlier in the prior video, something like that, where we have a button and we want to wait for a click event, and we want to fire some sort of function that does something every time that button is clicked. So this document object is very powerful, and there's a lot of things that we have to cover to understand what it actually does. So let me show you a basic example of this. We'll go back over to our CodePen, which we have a basic HTML document here, and I'm going to type document, and let's take a look at what we're dealing with. So right here we have this top level HTML wrapper, which we talked about is going to happen for every single HTML document. In CodePen, you'll notice over here we don't have that written, but CodePen is automatically wrapping our HTML within the HTML wrapper. All right, so we expand this down. We have a head, CodePen takes care of this, and a body. And then from here, this is where the actual HTML and JavaScript that we're writing is going to be placed. So you'll see that we have our H2 element, our paragraph element, and our button element. And then you also see some scripts down here at the bottom. And basically these scripts are what are represented here in the JavaScript. So any JavaScript we type here is connected up to our HTML document via these script tags. So again, don't have to understand how that all works. We'll get into that in future lessons, but I just wanted to show you the anatomy of this document object. Now, if you've been following this series all the way through and you went through the JavaScript series, you know how to write basic JavaScript, and you also know that if we have a JavaScript object, we can access properties of it. So let's define a basic object with a property, all right, something like prop1 and prop2. Nothing fancy here. But if we were to, or actually let's make a nested object as well. We'll say nested right here, and then we will end this. All right, so object.prop2.nested is going to equal our value right here, because we use the dot notation to access the different embedded properties and values within this object. Now, you would think that we could do the same thing with the document object, but we can't. All right, so if we try to do this same sort of access, let's clear the screen, and if we try document, and then let's go ahead and look at it one quick second. So we obviously have document, then we have HTML, then we have body. So if we typed document.html.body, it's going to say we cannot read the property of body because it's undefined. So we clearly cannot just access these different HTML elements with dot notation. We have to use the document object model API to do so. And it's a little bit different, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but hopefully we can walk through some of the more common ways to use it here in the remainder of this video. So I'm going to put on a new HTML document here with some additional parts to it so that we can really visualize what this DOM is all about. All right, so we can think of the document object model as a tree. And furthermore, we can think of this tree as kind of like we think about ancestry trees or whatever, where you have grandparents and then you have parents and you have children and stuff like that. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is this HTML document that we just created in this CodePen represented as the DOM tree. All right, so you can see that we have the document at the top, then we go down to HTML, and then from there we have the head and the body, and underneath the body specifically, we have all of this HTML that we have written here. And within that HTML, we have a lot of siblings, but we also have some children. So for example, let's look at this main div right here for the main body. So the main body div is going to be the parent to this h1 tag, these two p tags, and this ul or unordered list tag. All right, so that's going to be the parent to these four. Now if we look at the list items, its parent is going to be the unordered list and its grandparent is going to be the main body div. So you can see how these relationships start to build. And furthermore, we have, the concept of siblings. So all of these list items, these are all going to be siblings within the document object model. And this unordered list, the p tags, and the h1, they're all siblings. So what do we call all of these elements? Well, in the document object model, we call them all nodes. Now this is very different. You should not confuse this with Node.js. We'll talk about that later in the series, but that's basically the back-end server-side version of writing JavaScript. This is a totally different concept. All of these elements are considered nodes within the DOM tree. Now, of course, they're all different, so they're all different types of nodes. And I'm going to put the image back on the screen that we looked at in the prior part of this lesson when we talked about the basics of HTML. So within this element that we have defined, it's a total unit, we have different types of nodes here. So at the simplest level, we have something called an element node, and that's going to be represented by the p tag. All right, and then we have an attribute on that HTML element, and we call that an attribute node. And then finally, we have a text node, which is going to be the content that we're putting between the starting and closing paragraph tags. Now, to prove this out to you, I'm going to actually take this element and create it in JavaScript and then insert it into the page that we're looking at right here. All right, so the first thing we have to do is define each of those three different types of nodes. All right, so the first one is going to be an element node. And let me actually zoom out a little bit here. So we've got an element node, and we have to use the document object, and then we use create element. And before we do that, I keep forgetting, we have to change the context to CodePen so that we're working with the document that we're seeing over here rather than the whole document. All right, so sorry about that. And what we're going to do is create our element node, which is going to be a p tag. All right, so we're just creating that element we just put on the screen. So let's press enter, and we have created our first element node. And if we look at that, it's just going to be an empty p tag. There's nothing in it yet. All right, so now we have to create our text node. All right, so we're going to type document.create text node, and then here we're going to put in the word content, which is the stuff that was between the p tags. All right, so we press enter, and right now this element node is still empty. All right, so we still have an empty p tag, and the reason is we haven't assigned the text node to that element yet. Before we do that, let's create our last node, which is going to be an attribute node. So we'll create an attribute, and we want to call this a class attribute because that's the type of attribute we had on this HTML element. All right, so at this point, let's look at what we have here. So we have element node, which is a empty p tag. Then we have the text node, which is going to be content as a string, or more specifically a DOM string. And then finally, we have our attribute node, which is going to be class equals to empty. So basically we haven't assigned a value to this attribute yet, but we've initialized it. The first thing I want to do is I want to take our text node and I want to put it inside our p tag or element node. So all we have to do is say element node dot append child, and then we pass in the text node, press enter, and now when we print out the element node, it's going to be a p tag with that content placed between it. Now we are starting to build out this element. The next thing that we have to do is give a value to our attribute. So if you saw before, we have class equal to an empty string. All we have to do that is we say attribute node, and then we say dot value equals some class. All right. So now we have this attribute node. If we print that, it's going to say class equals some class. So we're getting closer. The only thing that we are missing is this attribute is not connected up with our paragraph element. So to do that, all we have to do is take our element node and we say set attribute, and then we pass in the attribute node, and it says it failed to execute because there are two. Oh, okay, I messed it up. So not set attribute, we have to set attribute node. All right, so we press enter there, and now the element node is going to be our full HTML element that we saw in the model before. The last thing we have to do is insert it into the document. And the way that we do that is we use the document object. So we type document, and then we use the append child method. We haven't talked about this yet, but I just want to show how it works. And now we just pass in element node. And if you look at the bottom of our code pen, you're going to see this element inserted into the document. And it's going to say it failed to execute. Because I messed up once again, I forgot I need to add one more piece of code in here. I need to say document.body. So instead of just inserting it at the end of the document, which represents the whole HTML document, I need to specify that I want to look at the body specifically. So if we go over to elements and we look at the entire, well, I guess this is not a good example because CodePen is adding a bunch of other stuff. But basically, we need to put in the body element. So let's press enter, and you can now see that our content has been inserted into our existing HTML document. So you may not have recognized it, but we're actually tapping into the DOM's API to do everything we just did. We created a new HTML element with JavaScript alone. And you can see that we use things like set attribute node and append child, and we've used create attribute, create text node, create element. These are all methods that are defined within the document object model. All right, so we are actually using the DOM as we speak here. Now, you might ask, what's the point of this? Every time we refresh the page, so if we refresh this page, reload it, we're not going to have those same elements inserted into our document anymore. And I'm not sure what I'm doing here. Okay, so HTML, I actually need to copy in some stuff here. It's because I didn't save the actual code pen. But whatever the case, that content at the bottom is going to be temporary. And you might ask, well, what's the point of inserting stuff with JavaScript? And the answer to that is for user experience. So when a user creates a calendar event on Google Calendar, you'll see a calendar event pop up immediately on that calendar. And that was done via JavaScript, tapping into the DOM. All right, another example is a user adds a to-do item to their to-do app, or a user creates a post on Facebook. All of these things are using JavaScript via the DOM, so the DOM's API, to insert elements and modify elements that are existing within the HTML document. But they're only temporary, and it's because we want a better user experience. So we want to immediately change that, web page, and then later we kind of save that to the database and reload it with new data later. All right, so at this point, we have gone through a lot of different angles to think about the DOM with, but we haven't actually, buckled down and tried to understand, how do we actually use the DOM here? What are some of the methods available to us? What exactly is the DOM? Like, we've been working with the window object and the document object, but there's so much more to it. We can also work with individual elements, and with each element, we can do certain things with that. Just like we talked about with HTML and JavaScript before, the purpose of this series is not to make you an expert in any one thing. It's to take you from zero to launching your first full stack application and deploying it. So we got to cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to walk you through an example of using the DOM. We're going to cover some of the common methods and properties that we can use within the DOM, but we're not going to cover everything. And quite frankly, most developers don't know everything about the DOM. It's very complicated, and there's a lot of stuff that you will never end up using within your career. Anyways, let's get started. Let's go ahead and put some new HTML in our CodePen. All right, and this one says, "Welcome to my HTML tutorial. Click the button below to begin." And this button, what we want to do with this is every time we click it, we want to add a new paragraph element to the bottom of this page. So how do we do that? Well, it's 3 steps. Number 1, we have to find a way to identify the button element so that we can start working with it. Number 2, we have to register a click event on this button, which is part of the DOM. It's part of the DOM API. And then number 3, we need to write a function that will insert a new paragraph element in the web page every time we click it. So let's take a look at our button here. We have a global attribute called ID. Every HTML element is able to have this ID attribute. And we also have a global attribute called class. Every HTML element is eligible to have a class on it. So we have multiple ways to identify this button. So let me take you through a couple of those ways to better explain some of the methods we have on the DOM. Here's the first way we can do it, and this is probably the most generic. We can say document.querySelector, and then we can just type in button, because this is going to be, button is going to represent the tag that we're looking for. So what this is going to do right now is it's going to look for any button on the entire page here, including CodePen's interface. And the reason is we don't have the right context. So let's go down to CodePen again and try this again. So we're going to select button, and what this is going to do is it's going to look through the HTML document that we're working with, and it's going to find the first occurrence of a button tag. And if it doesn't find it, it's just going to return null. Now the question is, how did I know to use this document.querySelector? All right, the reason I knew that is because if you go to the documentation, you go to APIs/DOM, then you go down to DOM, and you find that document object. So this is that document object that we talked about. It represents the HTML document itself. This has certain properties, and it has certain methods that are available for us to use. So if we scroll down all the way to the methods, you will see a couple of different query methods. So we have query command enabled. You won't use that much. Couple others, but you can see query selector. It's actually listed twice. I'm not sure if that's meant to be that way. I don't think it is actually, but we can go to query selector, and this will tell us basically how to use it. So we can put in selectors. It says a DOM string containing one or more selectors to match. This string must be valid. CSS selector string. So we don't know a whole lot about CSS quite yet, but basically what that means is if we pass in to this query selector, if we pass in something with a hashtag at the beginning, that represents an ID. So if you remember, we've got this ID equal to btn-1. So if we put the hashtag and type btn-1, we should be able to find this element again. Of course, we got to go back to the CodePen context. It's very annoying that I have to do that, but I promise it'll get a little bit easier in the future. So we'll go btn-1, and we can find that element that way. Now we can also use a class selector, which is a period. All right, so you can see our class is my-btn. So if we do period my-btn, we should be able to find the same button that way as well. And these are just more specific ways to find a single element within the DOM. Now, of course, as with anything in programming, there's lots of ways to solve the same problem. And if we go back to this documentation, let's go back to the main document object. And if we look at some of the methods here, we've got these query selectors, which are kind of generic query selectors that it's all I use to find elements within the HTML document. But you can also get an element by ID. All right, so that's another way to locate an element. So if we were to replace this, so we say get element by ID, and then this time all we have to do is pass in the ID. You don't even need a hashtag at the end. Oh, I messed this up here. All right, let's try that again. So get element by ID and button 1, and we should be able to find that button once again by using a different method. So as you can see, there's many ways to skin a cat here, and with the document object model, you can get very creative with your code. Now, the reason that selecting it by an ID is the most specific way to do it, and probably the best way to do this, is because you cannot have two elements with the same ID. So if I tried to copy this button down here, and it's got the same exact ID as the other button, it's going to have a conflict. So this is not really valid HTML. It'll still render, but it will cause you problems if you're trying to use any sort of front-end framework or even locate things with the DOM. So what I'm going to do here is paste in all of the different ways we can identify this one button. Let me get rid of the button here, the second one, and then it's going to kind of refresh, put me back in the wrong context, so I'm going to go back. And now if I paste in all of these different methods, so you can see there's quite a lot of different ways to identify this button, but these are all valid ways to do it. And this only executed, it looks like one of them, but if you were to type each of these in individually, it's going to locate it each time. But obviously there are some that are more specific than others, and we always prefer to be as specific as possible when identifying elements within the DOM. All right, so now that we know how to identify this element, let's go ahead and write that in our code. So far we haven't used this JavaScript section quite yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say add paragraph, and we're going to make a function that's going to be actually called every time we click that button. So from here, all we have to do is locate the button and assign it to a variable. So we're going to use one of those methods. I just will choose the query selector, and we're going to pass in the ID of that button in order to identify it. All right, so this button variable should represent our button, and from here, we should be able to do something with it every time it is clicked. And I'm actually going to not put this within the function. This will just be in the global scope of our JavaScript document here. I'm going to close out this console so that we have some more room to write just for a second. All right, so now we have this button being identified, and then we have a function that's going to add a paragraph. All right, and the last thing that we have to do is we have to add an event listener. So this is how we do that. We just say add event listener, and then we specify the event that we're trying to listen to, and then the function or the callback that we're going to pass in to execute on that event happening. Now, this is the first way to register an event on a specific HTML element. This is one way to do it. Another way to do it is if we take our element, button, and then we say onClick, and then we set it equal to add paragraph, then that's going to also register that event on the button. And then a third way we can do it is in the HTML itself. And this is what we looked at previously in this tutorial. If we come here to the button and we say onClick, and then we set that equal to add paragraph, and then we actually execute it within those parentheses, then that's going to register that click event as well. So there's 3 different ways that we can register a click event, but in this case, I want to do it directly with JavaScript. So we'll go ahead and go with this one. This is a pretty simple one. But you might be asking, like, how do we know that that's an event that's valid? And the reason we know that is if we go to the event reference within the MDN web docs, this is going to give us all of the different events that we have for elements on the web. All right, so not all of these are going to work with, like, say, a button, but a lot of these will just work for various components within a web page. So here we have mouse events, and you can see the click event, and this is going to tell us that the event handler property is the onClick, which is what we put in right here. So you'll get used to, you'll basically pick up on all of the common events with due time. There's only a few of them that are used on a frequent basis, and the onClick method is actually one of the most common events that you'll use in web programming. So at this point, we have our event wired up, and this add paragraph function is going to fire every time we click the button. So let's say the button is working, all right? And if we go ahead and open back up that console, so right-click, inspect, go to the console, and we're in the correct context, it looks like, and we can just say, or click the button, and it's going to say the button is working. And it's going to do it over and over again every time we click it. So the goal here is to insert a new paragraph element every time we click that button. Right now it's just console logging a string to the console, but we can also construct a new element just like we did before. And this time around, I'm going to show you a few shortcuts that's going to make it a little bit easier to create this paragraph element. Now we want to have some random data to be printed to each new paragraph element, so I'll just generate a random number. We'll say random num is going to be equal to math.floor. This is a trick that we learned in a previous lesson, and we'll just do between 0 and 100, something like that. All right, and then we're going to say the p content. This is what we want to actually add within that paragraph element. We're going to combine this with the random number. We're just going to say the random number is, and then we're going to add via string concatenation that random number. All right, so now the p content is the random string, and let's go ahead and just test that out real quick by printing our random string to the console every time it is clicked. All right, so we will click me, and it's going to say the random number is 8. All right, so that's done. Now we need to actually create our paragraph element. The way that we do that is going to be we're going to define a new element variable, and we're going to use the document.createNewElement method. All right, so if we go to the MDN docs and we go to technologies, APIs, DOM, and then we go down to the document object right here, and then we go down to the methods. All right, so we're going down to the methods here in the documentation, and we should see a create element right here. So it's not create new element. I don't know why I said that here. We're just going to do create element, and then we need to pass in the type of element that we're looking for. So if we look at the create element documentation, it's going to say that our tag name is the only required property or parameter of this method. So any tag name works. In this case, we're going to pass in p for that tag name, and now we have a new element assigned to a variable. The next thing that we'll do is we're just going to, instead of creating a new text node like we did in that first example, we're just going to take the new element and we're going to use a property called text content which exists on it, and we're going to set that equal to the p content variable that we created prior. All right, so if we go to the documentation here and we go to let's see, the element reference. So this is going to be of type element, and then the text content is going to be part of that. So really the fastest way to do this is just type text content, and it's going to be part of the node interface. So if you remember, the DOM tree is just constructed of a bunch of nodes, and no matter what type of node we're working with, it's always going to have the properties and methods of this node interface. So you can see in the properties, if we scroll down to text content, you can see that we can actually set this to new content directly. So we'll do that here. And now we just need to basically add this to the document. at the very end. So the way that we do that is we come down here at the bottom, we say document.body.append child, and then we put in the new element, which has our random text content. We'll get rid of this console.log here. All right, so here's the whole function that we're dealing with. So we have add paragraph, we get a random number, we generate random content from that number, we create a paragraph element, we assign the random content as the text content of that element, and then we append it to the end of the HTML body, which is basically going to be after this button. All right, so let's go ahead and test this out. So we press click me, and we're going to get a new paragraph element with a random number every time we click it. So it's pretty cool. Like, this is where programming starts to get kind of fun, is when we actually can start building things that are interactive and we can click buttons and get results. So hopefully this brings you a little bit of excitement. Obviously it's not something useful, but we will soon get there in future videos. As you can see with some of the examples we've gone through, there's really only a few methods and properties that you kind of have to remember with the DOM. We got the query selectors, so how do we identify the element we want, and then the methods where we can create new elements and modify both their content, their attributes. We haven't talked too much about that yet, but we can do a bunch of stuff with these elements. So the next thing we have to talk about is going to be, how do we navigate an HTML document? Now, I talked about the DOM tree and how there's, siblings and parents, grandparents, child, all that kind of stuff. And that's going to come into play here. How do we actually navigate through a complex HTML document? To do this, I'm going to copy in a predefined HTML document here that you'll see. We've looked at this before. And we're going to basically figure out how this DOM, all the DOM interfaces actually work here. When I talk about, DOM nodes and, elements, and how elements kind of inherit from a DOM node, like, what does that all mean? And that's going to become more apparent when we work through the navigation of this HTML document. So let's put that diagram back up on the screen, where we can see this document right here visualized as a tree. And from this, this visual, you can see that these list items are going to be siblings, and they're going to be children of the unordered list. So how do we select this unordered list and then get all of the children of it with JavaScript? Well, this is actually simpler than you might think. So we've already been able to identify elements from the DOM. So we use document.querySelector, and then we pass in either a tag or an ID or a class name, something like that, to identify it. Since we only have one unordered list in this entire document, we can just put in UL as the tag name, and that's going to, when we change the context here and try it again, that's going to select this list right here. Now let's go ahead and assign this to a variable so that we have something to work with. So we'll say our list is equal to document.querySelector, and then we're grabbing the actual HTML tag. So we press enter. Now we have a list, and that's going to be showing us the HTML here. Now obviously this is just a visual representation of the object, but if we wanted to figure out, what is this variable representing? What does the list variable actually represent? We have a way of doing that. If you're ever confused what type of variable you're working with, you can use this handy property that every node in the DOM tree has. All right, so if we say list.nodeType, it's going to return us a number. All right, and we wonder, what is that number? Well, if we go to the documentation and we type in node.nodeType, so if you were to just type in node type, you can find this. And once you click on it and scroll down to the constants, so these type constants, this will tell you what type of element you're working with. So in this case, we got the value of 1. And that tells us that we're working with an element node. And from here, we can click element, and we can see, okay, this is the type of node within the DOM that we're working with, and here are the properties and methods that are available to us. So if we were to scroll down and look at the properties of the element, we see this property called children. All right, so if we click on that, it's going to say the parent node property children is a read-only property that returns a live HTML collection which contains all of the child elements of the node upon which it is called. All right, so let's go back to our document here, and we'll say list.children. And you can see that we're getting returned this HTML collection. Now from here, HTML collection is of course another thing that we don't understand, but we can once again go back to the documentation and click on HTML collection to see what we're dealing with. And from here we can once again go over to the methods and properties, and there's this one method called item on the HTML collection, which is going to return us the element at a specific index of that HTML collection. So basically like an array that we've worked with in JavaScript before, but it's not quite an array. You can't just come over here and pass in brackets and put in a 0 or a 1. At least I don't think. Maybe you can. I'm not sure. Okay, maybe you actually can do that. But if we put in list.children.item and we select 1, this is going to select the second item of the list. So this is the way that I've always done it, in the way that the documentation kind of presents it, but it looks like, at least in the browser I'm working in, the bracket notation works as well. From here though, we can identify specific elements within our list, and then we can set those equal to variables just like we did the list itself. So if we come over to the left and we say list item is equal to the second one in the list, and we press enter. Now we have that entire HTML element stored in a variable, and we can use different properties on it to modify it. So if we came over here and we said list item, which is representing that second item, and we said text content, all right, this is list item number 2, but we can set it equal to some new content. All right, so we did this already, but watch what happens in the HTML document. When I press enter, it changes the content. So this is just kind of showing you how you can, look at the whole DOM tree, and you can say, okay, here's the parent, and then I can get children, and then I can select one of the child elements of that, set of children, and then from there I have a standalone HTML element that I can do all sorts of things with. I can set event listeners on it, I can change the text content, and I can do all sorts of other things that are defined by the documentation that I'm working with. Now, once again, maybe we don't know what this list item represents. What is the node type of it? Well, all we have to do is say node type, and we get the answer of 1 once again, which means it is an element. And from there, we just go to the documentation. We can just go back up here and just search element, and then from here we have all of the properties, all of the methods, all of the event listeners that are available to this specific element that we have stored in a variable. All right, the next thing I want to do is I want to dig a little bit deeper into this concept of nodes. So I've been beating around the bush here a little bit, talking about how everything in the DOM tree is considered a node, but we've also been looking at elements and HTML collections and stuff like that. And it can get very confusing, like all of these different interfaces, what's going on here? Like these are all different data types, they all have different properties and methods. How do I know where to look, what has what available to it, so on and so forth? Well, before I get into this, this is a object-oriented programming concept. And that's not something that we've covered yet. We may cover it in future videos, but this gets into things like classes and inheritance and class methods and static methods and all that kind of stuff. And the thing that I want you to recognize right now is that we have all these different interfaces defined by the DOM. All right, so at the very top, we have this thing called a node. So let's go back to the node. And what I want you to remember is that everything in the DOM inherits from this node interface. So everything below it, so an element, or an HTML element interface. These all inherit up to this node interface, which basically means these elements have all of their own properties and methods, but they also have access to this, master node interface as well. So if we were to go look at some of the things we have available on this node, you can see this append child method that we've been using quite frequently. And let's see if we can find a couple other ones. It looks like that might be the only one that we've been using. But we also have text content. So we've been using that to modify the text within an HTML element. And we have node type. We've used that one before. Let's see what else. It looks like that's pretty much it. But you can see that this node has a bunch of properties and methods that are available to anything below it. So in other words, if we come back to our document here, our HTML document, and we know that we have this unordered list stored in the variable called list, all right? And we know that list, if we say list.nodeType, it is of type element, which inherits from that, node interface that basically defines every element. From here, all we have to do is we say list.appendChild, and that's going to be a valid method because it's part of the node interface as we just saw. And from here, we can insert an HTML element and actually add it to the end of this list. But first, we have to actually create that element, and this will be a good opportunity to show another method that we've already seen but didn't really dig into yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take list.appendChild, and I'm going to say create element, and we're going to make it a list item. And this is going to be completely empty, no content within it. And you can see that we have a new list item showing up at the end of this list. And all we have to do now is we say list.children, and we select the final element, we have to say item, and then we select the final element, and then we say text content, and we can put in some content here. And now we have added a new item to the end of the list and modified it. So you can see how we can start parsing through and navigating through this hierarchy pretty easily once we get the hang of it. Now what I want to introduce is something a little bit tricky, and this is where we really have to think when we're navigating through the DOM. Because in this HTML document, you can see that we have two P elements that don't have an ID and they don't have a class. And that basically means we have no way of identifying these in an easy, specific way. So the first way that we can, think about identifying one of these elements is by the query selector method. And what we're going to try to do here is basically insert another element between these two paragraph tags. And if you go to the documentation and you go to I believe it's the node, let's see. Yeah, so the node interface has this method called insert before. And what that does is it basically inserts a HTML node or element that inherits from node before a specific reference element. So basically in our case, we're going to use this method, and we're going to have to figure out how do we identify this second P tag right here. Now the way that we would think about doing this is we say document.querySelector, and then we grab anything that has a P tag, all right? And in this case, when we press enter, we're going to get the wrong one because the query selector method only gets the first occurrence. Now what we can do is we can change this to query selector all. And what this is going to return us is a node list. So unlike an HTML collection, which we got when we looked at the children of that unordered list, now we have just a node list, which is a slightly different data type. If we didn't know what this meant, we can just go back to the documentation and we can type in node list. And let's see what this does. All right, so node list objects are a collection of nodes usually returned by properties such as node.childNodes and methods such as document.querySelectorAll, which is what we used. And let's look at, a few more things. We have some properties, we have the length of it, and then we have methods. So we have this method called item, similar to HTML collection, where we can select something with an index. So we can go ahead and do that, and we can actually just chain it to the end of this. So we'll say item, and then maybe we'll pass in item number 1. And that's going to get the first index. So remember, it's 0 index. So the first P element will be 0, then the next one will be 1. So now we have selected the second element, and what we want to do is we want to assign that to a variable. So we'll say P element is equal to that. And now we want to use the P element. Let's first say node type, and we're going to get a type of 1, which means it's an element type. And we know that element is kind of like a child, or it inherits from that node type, which is the base class. So we're getting the node type, and so we know that the P element, or P elem, is going to have this insert before method. So let's go ahead and learn how do we use that. So if we go back to what we were looking at previously, so we've got node.insert before. Now let's look at the syntax. We learned about this in prior lessons, how to read this documentation. And what we're seeing here is that we have the parent node right here is going to be the parent of the newly inserted node. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the parent to the node that we're trying to insert? Let's go back to our HTML document, and maybe we can even pop up the diagram on the screen and see that what is the parent to an element that we insert between these two paragraph tags. In other words, what is the parent of one of these paragraph tags? Well, the answer is going to be the main body div. All right, so we need to pass in a reference to this main body div as that first parent node right here. So we know that we have to select that, and then we have to put in a new node, which is going to represent a new element that we create, and then finally a reference node. So the reference node, as we can see down here, is going to be the node or the element that our new one is going to be inserted before. Or we're going to insert it before this element. All right. So if this is null, then the new node is inserted at the end, but we don't care about that because it's not. So let's go back, and the first thing that we need to do is identify that parent. So we'll say parent is equal to document.querySelector. And then this time, since we have a class to select it by, we're going to select it with the class notation. So we have parent, we'll just check that we're getting the right one. And now we just have to say parent.insert before, all right? And then we have to make a new node. So the new node is going to be a P element. So let's go ahead and create that real quick. So, or actually no, we need to create a new element. So new P tag is going to be document.create element of type P, and then we're going to assign some text content. We'll say programmatically added between. All right, so now we have our new element, and finally we're going to take the parent, we're going to insert before, we're going to pass in the new element that we're putting there, and then we're going to reference the element that we want to insert it before. So that would be P elem. All right, so we did that up there before. So let's see if this works. And you can see that we have programmatically added this paragraph tag between these two paragraph tags right here. So this was a little bit of a tricky example, and we kind of ventured out into a method that we definitely had to read the documentation for before we knew how to use it. But this just goes to show how we can kind of navigate around the DOM by visualizing it as a tree and really understanding what's the parent, what's the child, what's the sibling, and what is the interface that I'm working with within the DOM. All right, if you are still watching this video, that's awesome. Most people are not going to make it through this kind of conversation about the document object model, but I will say that if you're at this point and you're very confused, that is totally okay. The purpose of this video in this crash course, especially this section about the document object model, is not to make you an expert at it. The purpose is to expose you to what it is, what are some of the things we can do with it, and just get you started and thinking independently of, okay, if I don't know something, how do I go figure it out? You know, we went through a bunch of examples where I didn't necessarily know how to use these different methods, and I didn't know what type of data we're working with, but you go to the documentation, you search for it, and you figure it out. So if you're confused, that's totally okay. Keep moving forward. We're not going to actually be using the DOM all that much throughout the rest of the series, but as I said in the beginning, it's super important that you understand what it is, because it is at the root of every front-end framework that you're going to work with. You know, if you start working in React, you're going to hear something called the virtual DOM. And if you don't know what the real DOM is, it's going to be very hard to understand what the virtual DOM is. And furthermore, if you're working with like Angular or Vue.js, you know, these all connect in with this DOM API to basically expose their own API. So you're going to, you know, have some easier ways of working with this HTML once we get into front-end frameworks, but underneath the surface, those frameworks are just connecting in with the same API that we just used in this video. So to do a huge recap of HTML, I think of it in two different parts. First is going to be the static HTML, and that's going to be just the HTML, like the stuff you see on the page here. This is static HTML, and no matter what you do, it's not going to change. All right. Now the next part is dynamic HTML. And that is what we see when we start working with the DOM and we start manipulating and adding, removing, changing, modifying, those kind of things with the existing static HTML. So there are two different parts. The first one's pretty simple, and I think you probably caught you know, how to use it pretty easily. But the second one is very confusing. And even once you work with this for years, it's still going to be something that you're learning over and over and over again and perfecting along the way. But what I really want you to take away is that we can model an HTML document in a predictable way, and then we can write a specification called the document object model and allow JavaScript to connect in with that API to actually modify the static HTML. Now, the very last thing before we get into our lesson code challenge is going to be semantic HTML. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but when we first went through it at the beginning of this crash course, we were talking about the most simple elements possible. So we've got divs, we've got paragraph tags, images, inputs, lists, all of those kind of things. With the new HTML5 spec, the new thinking on HTML is that, you know, consistent with the concept that we want to use it for structure, we also want to use it for intent. So what do we intend to use these different elements for? Are we trying to section off a part of the web page? Are we trying to make a nav bar? Are we trying to make a footer? You know, normally you would just put all of this into div elements. So you can make a header and a nav bar and a blog section and a sidebar and a footer. You can make all of those things with just divs. But in the new HTML5 spec, it's, you know, you're basically supposed to plug into some of the new tags that they have available. And in this case, instead of using divs for all of these different features of your web page, you should be using a nav bar, so the nav tag. And for your section, so like the blog section, that should use a section tag, as well as the sidebar and stuff like that. And then you have this tag called main, which represents the main content of the page. And then you have an article tag, which might represent a single blog post. And then finally you have a footer tag, which obviously represents the footer. So all of these give more semantic, more meaning to the intent of how you're trying to use your HTML. And it's not super important for you starting out, but I want you to understand that it is out there, and when you see other people writing HTML and people that are really paying attention to best practices, you'll see those different elements pop up. But remember, you can always look at the documentation. If you ever have a question about a certain type of HTML tag, go to the documentation and type it into the search bar and read about it. That's the only way and the best way to learn as you're reading through other people's code. All right, this has been a pretty long HTML crash course, but unlike some shorter crash courses, I really wanted to walk you through my line of thinking and help you be more independent when thinking about HTML in the document object model. So hopefully this was informative. And now I have a challenge for you that's going to really test you. This is a tough one, but I'll go ahead and solve it with you on video after you've tried it yourself. And hopefully by doing so, you're going to learn a lot about, how do we reason through some of these different concepts, and how do we take our static HTML and make it dynamic and bring something to life. So what you see on the screen, I showed it to you before, but this is what we're going to create, where we basically have a random generator for memes and jokes and random quotes and then riddles, so we can reveal the answer. And this will be a really cool project that I think you'll be excited to share with your network, and be sure to tag me on Twitter with it. 100 Days of Code is the hashtag that you want to use. But I'm really excited to dive into this. So in the next video, we're going to be solving it. But I recommend that you first try it on your own and see how far you can get. So the link to the CodePen starter pack is in the description. And what you're going to be working with is basically this right here. So let me go back to the starter portion. All right, so we have some code already written for you. So I've already put some buttons in here, and I've already linked up some of the events that are going to be called. And then I've made some template functions for you that are going to correspond to those click events. And then finally, I have all this random data down here, so a bunch of random quotes and meme URLs and stuff like that. And then I have a helper function called getRandomData, where in each of the methods that you're going to implement yourself, it's already grabbing a random piece of data that you just need to figure out how to put into the HTML document and display it in the right spot. Once again, I'm leaving a link in the description so you can go through and see what are the user stories. So user stories are basically what should a user be able to do when they're looking at this application. And so I've got those written out. I also have a few hints to help you out, just point you in the right direction on this. And then once you've tried it, watch the next video of this series and we will solve it together. Welcome to the Lesson 7 Code Challenge. And this is going to be basically an HTML plus JavaScript challenge where we're going to use the DOM to basically loop in our JavaScript into our HTML and bring it alive into a dynamic web page that's going to basically generate random memes, jokes, quotes, and riddles. So if you haven't seen this before, you can click these buttons on the right and it should generate something random every time we click it. And we can do jokes and quotes and riddles, and you have to reveal the riddle answer by clicking this button right here. So this is going to be a really cool challenge. You can obviously see that there are some styles already applied to it. And since we haven't covered CSS yet in this Full Stack Roadmap series, that's going to be the next lesson, I've done this for you. So I've already wired up all of the CSS styles, and all you have to do is write the HTML and the JavaScript to make this thing come to life. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the user stories. So this is from the blog post that I wrote here for this lesson. And just as a recap, a user story is something that we use quite often in programming to come up with requirements. A good example of a common user story is every time a user enters his email and password and clicks login, the user should be dropped into their home page within the app. That's a basic user story that just says, okay, when the user does this, this happens. And we have some user stories defined for this code challenge. The first one is a user should be able to click buttons on the right side of the screen to generate random memes, jokes, quotes, or riddles. So as we saw, we can click these buttons and get something random, obviously going in the correct location. Only one piece of content, so this is the second one, only one piece of content should show at a time. So for example, if the user clicks show a meme and there's a quote already showing, the application should remove the quote and show a random meme. So as you see, every time I click a new button, this content right here is going to disappear and it's going to replace it with nothing and then generate a different type of content. So right now we have a riddle. If we replace it with a joke, that goes away down here and our joke shows up here. So that's another requirement. The third one, content should be displayed under the appropriate heading. So in other words, if I click tell me a joke, the joke needs to show up under tell me something funny rather than I want a riddle or something like that. And then when showing a random riddle, the answer should never be revealed before the user explicitly clicks to reveal the answer. So when I click riddle, you're going to see that I get the riddle, but I don't get the answer. And I have to click this reveal riddle answer in order to get the answer itself. The next one is if a user clicks reveal riddle answer and there is no riddle, an alert should show letting them know. So in other words, there's no riddle populated down here, and if I click reveal riddle answer, I get an alert up here at the top of the screen saying there's no riddle to show an answer for. And then likewise, if a user clicks reveal riddle answer and the answer is already revealed, an alert should let them know that it's already there. So let's go to a riddle, let's reveal it, and then let's click this again, and the riddle it's going to say the riddle answer is already exposed. All right, so those are the requirements, and of course I gave some hints here. The div element with a unique ID or class name can be a great way to establish a container for future content. So I'll show you how that works. We also need to use the HTML element .hidden property. So that has to do with hiding and showing that riddle answer. It says there's no perfect solution. There's obviously 100 solutions to this. And then we got some starter code. All right, so here is the starter code that we're working with. And we have to basically take this, which only has some buttons that don't do anything yet, and we have to turn it into this, a working content generator. So as we solve this, I'm going to try to walk you through my thought process a little bit, but I'm not going to spend an overly detailed amount of time on each of the components. Like the main purpose of this is to give you the solution, not to basically build an entire app and think through every last detail of it. So let's go to our starter, and we'll keep this one up so that we have a template to look at of what we're trying to do. And then from this starter, let's go ahead and get acquainted with what is here already. So we'll start in the HTML section. You can see in this HTML section we have, let's zoom out just a little bit, we have some instructions. So notice how we've used semantic HTML here. So at the end of the previous video we talked about semantic HTML, how HTML should show intent. And what we've done here is we've created a main tag, which is going to say here's the main content area. And then we have one section, which is going to be the content. This is the empty area right here. And then we have another section called sidebar, which is where all the actions are. Okay, so that's what we mean by semantic HTML. And it looks like everything has been implemented for us. So we have our actions, our buttons, and our buttons are connected up to click events that are down in the JavaScript section. So our content, what we're going to do is add it right here in the section with a class called content. All right, so then of course we have CSS. This is just styling the whole web page for us, but this is not required since we haven't really talked about how to use CSS yet. So this should just automatically work for us, and there's no action required by us in that. And then finally we have JavaScript. All right, so this one's where some of the tricky part is going to come in, where we're going to be working with the document object model. As you can see, we have some templated functions and we have our to-do items. So with each of these functions, we need to show a random piece of content in the correct location and never show more than one at a time. So similar to our user stories, this is just reiterating that. So we have a show meme function, which is going to be connected up. If we look at our HTML, it's connected up with this show meme button. All right, so if we were to go down here at the bottom of this function and just console.log is working, all right, so we've got that connected up, and now we just click show meme, and if we open up the console, so down at the bottom left, and we see is working, we know that this has been wired up correctly. So lucky for us, we've got this wired up already, no work to be done there. All right, so we've got a show meme, then we have show joke, which is wired up to this button, and then that does the same thing for quote and riddle for the next two buttons. And then finally, the reveal answers function is going to be wired up to this reveal riddle answer button. All right, and obviously this is styled a little bit differently, but it's still a button HTML tag. And then at the bottom, you can see a bunch of code that I wrote already for you, which is just a bunch of content that we can use for randomly generated content. And then it has a couple of helper methods. So it has a data object, it gets a random number, and then it uses those two things in this method right here to get random data. So basically what we do is we pass in, we have a parameter called type, and if we pass in memes, we'll get a random meme. And if we pass in riddles, we'll get a random riddle. And you can see that I've already hooked that up to these functions that are wired up to the buttons. So as you can see, we have for the meme one, we have already assigned a variable to this random meme URL. And if we were to just console.log what we're getting here, and then we press show a meme, hold on. So show a meme, let's go to the console, and you'll see that we get a link to an image, which is going to represent the meme. All right, so that's the overview of what we're working with. All we have to do is write some HTML and then finish these functions that have already been templated out for us. I think the first thing that we'll do is probably the easiest. So in our template, you can see that we have these headings here. So this output looks like an H2 heading. And these ones down here look like maybe H3 headings or something like that. So let's go ahead and put those in there. So where it says your HTML code goes here, let's make an H2. So all you have to do in CodePen, it's pretty easy, is type the tag that you want to make and then press tab, and it creates that element for you. So we'll go ahead and type output and see what we get. Looks like we're getting the correct element there. And now we have to go to the headings. So we want, in the next one, we want an H3, and we want programmer memes. So far so good, we're looking okay. Tell me something funny, so this will be jokes. So another trick you can use in CodePen and also Visual Studio Code once we start working with it, if you go to the end of a line and press Control-C and then press Control-V, you'll get the same line copied down. So let's do that one more time and then replace the text within it. So give me some wisdom and I want a riddle. Actually, we need one more. So we've got programmer memes. Oh, we missed the tell me something funny. So let's do that real quick. All right, so we've got our output and all of our sections defined. Now, if you remember in the user or in the hints, if we go back here and look at the hints, it says the div element with a unique ID or class name can be a great way to establish a container for future content. So what I mean by that is if we go here and we look at these headings, we obviously have to insert some sort of HTML element, probably a paragraph tag, after each of these. Now, how do we know where to put it? Like, how do we select each of these headings and have a container to put it after them? Well, something that I think is smart to do is create a div element, which is going to act as that container for all of our future paragraph tags, which will have, or paragraph or image tags, which will have the content itself. So let's see what we're going to do here. So I think what we want to do is after each of these headings, instead of trying to dynamically figure out where to put these different pieces of content, let's be explicit about it. So let's make a div. So we'll type div, and we want to give it a class or an ID because we want to be able to identify this individual div as the container that we want to put the content in. So for this one, let's just give it a class and we'll call it meme content. All right, so we'll enter down, and basically what we want to accomplish with the JavaScript is we want to identify this div, and then we want to insert our content within that container that's already sitting there ready and waiting for us. Now we could programmatically generate a div like this, but it just would be a lot of extra work, unnecessary work, and it would require a lot more code. So let's do this with all of the different sections. So we'll go down here. And now let's just replace these classes because we want unique identifiers for our JavaScript to basically be able to query. So this one will be jokes content, or joke content. We'll stay consistent here. And then quote content, and finally riddle content. All right, so these should be able to be selected by JavaScript very easily. All we would need to do, let me save this real quick. All we need to do is open up the console. Let me see if I can get this. All right, so the console looks like we're in the right JavaScript context, and all we need to do is document.querySelector, and then since we have classes here as the attribute, we need to use the class selection syntax, which is the dot preceding the name of the class. So if we wanted to select this container right here called meme content, we can just type in dot meme content, and we should get that div. All right, so from there, all we have to do if we want to insert something in it is we save it in a variable. So we'll maybe say a container, and then from there we say container.append child, and then this is where we pass in our generated HTML element. So in this case, let's just go ahead and create something for that. This is just practice to understand how we're solving this problem. We're not actually doing anything yet. So we'll say new element is equal to document.createElement, and then maybe we want to put in, let's go ahead and practice this with the meme container. So we need to put in an image. So to do that, we type in image tag. All right, so we're going to create that element, and then we're going to use something called the set attribute property. All right, so in order to create an image element, we know how to do that, so let's go ahead and practice that here. If we say image, it's going to give us a source attribute and an alt attribute. We're going to ignore this alt attribute because it's not like totally necessary. And then from here, we can pass in a URL to an image, and that will display it within the browser here. So let's just go ahead and go down to our data here, and we've got this array of memes. So let's just grab one of the URLs just to test it for a second and paste that into the source attribute of our image. And you can see that our image is coming in there nicely, and I've actually written some CSS. If you were to look in the CSS portion, I've actually selected all images here, and I've said that the max width is going to be 350 pixels. So it's already going to come in nicely for you. You don't have to worry about doing that. So this is basically what we want to insert into that specific programmer memes area. And if we wanted to do that, we've already got our new image element, and all we have to do here is say new element dot set attribute. All right, so if we didn't know anything about this, this is how we'd figure it out. So first we say new element dot node type. So we talked about this in the prior video. Looks like we lost the context, so we have to go back to the CodePen context. Let's see if that still has this. Okay, we got to redefine this real quick. So first, let's select the container. So we just got to redo this because it lost the context that we were working in. So now we have the container, which is the meme content. And then we have to create the new element. All right, so we created an image. And now we just say new element.nodeType, and it's going to return us 1. Now in the MDN documentation, let's go to the MDN documentation real quick. And let's type in nodeType. This is a method we learned about prior in prior videos, and you can see in the node constant or the node type constants, a value of 1 represents an element. So let's click on that element, and then we come down and we can see that within the element there are methods, and one of those should be, if I'm remembering this correctly, is set attribute. So if we click on set attribute, it says that we give it the name of the attribute we're wanting to set and then the value we want to set. So in this case, if we were trying to set the source attribute of an image, we just have to say new element.set attribute. Source is the name of the attribute we're setting, and then maybe we'll paste in that link that we had earlier, so that will be the value of the source. So we press enter. And now what we can do is basically take this new element that we have, and we take the container and we append child. We use the append child method to pass in that new element, and boom, we have a new image showing up in that section that we want it to show up in. So like I said, we haven't actually done anything. This is just practicing and figuring out in the live console, like, okay, how do we actually reason through this? What methods are we going to use? All that kind of stuff. Now we should be able to go down into the JavaScript and implement some of these functions to do exactly this. All right, so let's close this out here. We don't need this for a little bit. And then let's refresh the page because we want a clean slate here. It looks like, actually not sure why this is still there. Let's see. Oh, that's right, because we had put this in here already. Okay, let's get rid of that. We don't want anything to start off. We want this to be empty. And now let's come down to our templated methods. And in this case, we want to show a meme. Right now, when we click the button and we open up the console, it's going to print a random meme URL. And we know that this URL should be set equal to the source attribute of an image tag or image HTML element. So we also know how to create that. So let's go ahead and start writing this method. The first thing we need to do is grab the container that we want to put it in. So we will say container will be equal to document.querySelector, and then we need to pass in meme content, all right? So we should have the container selected. You could obviously test that if you wanted to. I think if we just pass it into console.log, we should be able to do that. And show a meme, and we get the correct container, so we're doing good so far. From here, we need to say new image is going to be equal to document.create. Is it create element or new element? I can't remember. Okay, so it is create element, and we want an image element. Now we just need to set the attribute. So we want to set the source attribute. And what do we want to set that equal to? Well, we want to set it equal to a URL, and we happen to have that already. So we just drop in the random meme URL, and that should set the attribute for us. And then finally, we come down here at the bottom and we say container.append child, and we pass in our new image. Okay, so let's go ahead and save our pen here. And when we click this show meme, we should get an image populating in the right section. And we do. All right, so if we click it again, it should put another image in there after this. And it does. And then another one. And we could keep going with that, but obviously the instructions, one of the user stories, is saying if there's already something there, delete it and replace it with the new one. So we have to figure out how to do that. And a good way to do that is by using an if statement. So if we come down to our method here of showMeme, we need to ask before we insert that into the container, we need to say if there's an existing image there. So how do we do that? One way that I can think of is if we take we'll just say set a variable isImage equal to container.querySelector, and then we'll look for an image. So basically what this is doing is it's saying this container, which represents this div right here, if we grab that container and within it we look for an image element, and if we find something, then this value isImage is going to represent the actual HTML element. If we don't find anything, then it's going to return null. So we're going to get nothing. So basically what we have to do is we say if isImage, so if that's a truthy value, it should be truthy as long as it comes back with an image, then we need to clear the contents of this container. So a way that we can do that is by using the inner HTML property. And if we go to the MDN documentation, I believe this exists on the Node interface. So let's take a look. Looks like it's not here. So let's search for that. So inner HTML. Okay, so it's on element. So on each HTML element, there is this property called inner HTML. And it says the element property inner HTML gets or sets the HTML markup contained within the element. So a quick trick, this is something that I just have learned over time, you wouldn't necessarily know it from this documentation, is you can pass in an empty string to this property to clear all the HTML from a specific container. So if there's an image already there, we're going to say the container's inner HTML is equal to an empty string. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is every time we click this button, we're going to generate a random meme URL, then we're going to create a new image, we're going to check if there's an existing image, and if so, clear it, and then we're going to insert the new image. So basically, this is another way of saying let's replace whatever's there. So let's try it out. So we got our first image here, and if we click this again, it should replace it. Excellent. So we are replacing it correctly. We've got this in the right spot. And for the rest of the methods, we pretty much should be able to implement the same type of logic and implement it for all the rest of the buttons. So let's get rid of this to do because we have done it. We have implemented that correctly. Now, one thing I want to do before we get any further is implement this clear all method. Now, the reason I want to do this is because it's basically, since we see that we have buttons that kind of do the same thing, we don't really need to write this logic right here every single time. All we need to do is we need to write one method that looks at all of the containers here, and it clears all of the containers before we replace it with new content. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and take some of this code here. So we'll take that out of there and put it in the clear all. So let's rename this variable and we'll say meme, all right? And let's go ahead and grab this container. So actually this is not valid code. We need to type document.querySelector and we need to grab the meme content container. So we'll say meme container is equal to that. And this should represent this div right here. Now we can do the same thing for the other divs, so the joke content and the quote content and the riddle content. So I'll show you what we're going to do here. Like, this will make sense in a second, so just bear with me. So we're going to copy this down 4 times. We're going to say this one will be a joke container, this one will be a quote container, and this one will be a riddle container. And then we of course have to replace this with joke and quote and riddle. All right, so in this JavaScript that we just wrote, we are basically selecting each of these containers that should have the content that we're putting in. And from here, all we have to do is set the inner HTML to an empty string. And no matter if there's something there or there's nothing there, it doesn't matter. We're just going to clear it no matter what. So we'll say meme container.inner HTML equals an empty string. And we'll do that 4 times over and just replace these variables with the correct one. All right, so this clear all method is going to look in all of the different sections and it's going to clear them, no matter what's there. So all we have to do down in this show meme thing is before we append a new image, we just have to call the clear all method. So that should clear everything out. So let's try it out. Let's show a meme and then click it again. And it looks like it's clearing it and putting in the new one. And that's going to happen for all of these because we're just going to pass this clear all method into each of these template functions. Okay, so the next one is show a joke. All right, so we've already got a random joke text, but let's go ahead and console.log the random joke text just to see what we're working with. So let's click the button, make sure it's working, and let's open up the console. All right, it looks like we're getting a string that represents the joke. So in this case, we want to insert a paragraph element and put this text content in it. All right, so this should be rather simple. So we'll say new paragraph is equal to document.createElement, and we'll put in a p tag. And then we say p.textContent is equal to the random joke text. So I'm taking the variable here, which should be equal to a random joke, and I'm assigning it to the new p element that I just created. And then finally, I need to clear all because I need to clear anything that's there already. And then I need to insert it into the container. So before we wrote out a different variable that selects the container and then we did it in 2 steps, but we can basically just do this in 1 step. So we can say query selector. In this case, we want to get the joke content. Can't type. And then at the end, we can just chain on this append child and pass in the new paragraph element. Let's see if that works by clicking tell me a joke. And it's saying P is not defined. That's because I, for some reason, just said P instead of new P. So that should work better this time. All right, so we're getting some content here. Now, this will be the real test. If I click show a meme, does this content get erased and a meme show up? That's what should happen. So let's show a meme, and we see that in the jokes section, there's nothing there, which is great. So let's tell another joke, and you can see that we have a joke but no meme. So far, everything's working great. So let's go to the next method that we need to implement. So this will be a quote. All right, so let's go ahead like we've been doing. We'll console.log the random quote, and we'll click the button. And you can see in the console, we get an object with 2 keys, or 2 properties. We have the author property and the quote property, both which are strings. So what we want to do here is we want to display a p or a paragraph element, and then another paragraph element right below it with the author. So let's do that. So we'll say the quote itself is going to be document.createElement, and that will be a paragraph element. And then we'll say the author is going to be document.createElement, and that will also be a p element. Now for the text content, the quote will be pretty straightforward. We just say quote.textContent equals the random quote, and then we need to actually get the quote property, which is the quote itself. Now for the author text content, we need to grab the random quote again and grab the author property, but we also want to put that little dash before it. So all we have to do is make a string with a dash and a space, and then we concatenate that with the author name. All right, so we've got our text content, let's see if we did this right. So we got our quote and then our author stored in 2p elements. So now all we should have to do is first clear all. So we clear everything out, and then we come down here and we say document.querySelector. We want to grab the quote content container, and then we append child, and we put in the, first we want to put in the quote. And then the next thing we want to do is grab the same container and put in the author. So let's go ahead and run this. Looks like we got a random quote working just fine, but this is kind of messy. I want to refactor this a little bit. We never want to write the same thing 2 lines in a row. That's just bad practice. So what we want to do is we want to store the container like we did before in a variable. So let's put this right here. So now we have the container in that container variable, and now we just have to call container.appendChild for both of these. And this should work still. Awesome. So now we can do jokes, we can do quotes, and we can do memes, and they all kind of clear each other out when a new piece of content is generated. Now the last one is going to be the hardest one, and that's because we only want to show the riddle itself, but we don't want to show the answer to it until this reveal riddle answer is clicked. So let's mark off our to-dos here. We are done with the show quote, we are done with the show joke, and we're done with the clear all method, so we're doing pretty good here. And finally we have to show the riddle. So I think what we're going to do is let's first see what we're getting. It already shows us, I already wrote in a comment that says this is what you should get, but let's just verify it. Always good practice. So console.log random riddle, and let's click the button. We get our random riddle with a answer prop and question prop. So let's go ahead and be explicit about this, and I'm going to show you a little ES6 or the latest spec of JavaScript. I'll show you a trick on how to destructure, I believe that's the correct term for it, but we're going to destructure properties off of this object. So all we have to do is we say const, and then we put these little brackets here, and then we pass in the properties that we're looking for. So we want a question and we want an answer, and that will be set equal to the random riddle that we're getting. So now we should be able to console.log a variable called question as well as a variable called answer right here. So let's see if that is true. All right, so we got these printing out okay. And basically what I did here, this right here is the equivalent. So let me comment it out for a second. What I just wrote there is the ES6 or the latest spec of JavaScript equivalent syntax to doing this. So we say question is equal to random riddle.question, and then answer is equal to random riddle.answer. So these 2 lines of code can be simplified into this single line of code right here by putting these little brackets around there and selecting the property that you want. So that's just a little trick thought I'd show you as we're solving this. All right, so we've got our question, we've got our answer. Now we have to create our paragraph elements. So I think we're going to show the question and the answer both in a paragraph element, just like we did with the quote, but we obviously have to hide the answer up front. So how we'll do that is this. We'll say the question element will be equal to document.createElement. We'll put a paragraph tag in there, and then we'll set the text content equal to the question itself. And then let's go ahead and take, since we're inserting twice, let's go ahead and get a single variable for the container. So document.querySelector, and we'll grab the riddle. We need a dot at the beginning to select a class. We want the riddle content div, so that will be this riddle content div, and that should work. And now we want to say container.append child, and we'll put in the question element. Let's see if that works. Okay, awesome. We have this paragraph element representing the riddle, and now what we have to do is we have to insert the answer, but we have to make it hidden. All right, so I think the way that we're going to do this, if you remember from the hints, it says you may need to use the HTML element.hidden property. So let's take a look at what that is. So the HTML element property hidden is a Boolean, which is true if the element's hidden, otherwise it's false. And you can actually set this equal to true or false to navigate between something that shows and something that hides. So that's good to know. We should be able to use that on any element that we're working with here. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a, similar to this question element. Let's just copy this down. And this time, it's going to be the answer. So we'll do answer element. And then that will be set equal to the answer. All right, now there's one additional thing that we have to do. So we've got this button over here called reveal the riddle answer. And that's going to call this function down here called reveal answers. Now, if we're anticipating in the future, this is something that you'd probably figure out after you implemented it and you're like, oh, shoot, I realize this now, but I've already built this, I know how it works. So what I'm saying is that in the future, we're going to have to click this button and we're going to have to figure out whether there's a riddle answer available and whether that riddle answer is hidden or not hidden. So in order to do that, in order to make our jobs easier, we should probably set an ID attribute on this paragraph tag we're calling answer. So we've already set the text content. So let's go ahead and append this to the HTML. So just so that you can see what's going on here. So we're appending the answer element. So now when we say riddle me, we get the riddle and the answer, which is obviously not what we want to do. But what we can do here is after this, we say answer element.set attribute. And what I want to set is an ID. And then what I want to do with that ID is set it to riddle answer. All right, so what this is basically going to do is down here in the riddle content, it's going to create a p tag that has an ID equal to riddle answer. Okay, and then the answer to the riddle will be sitting right there. So later on, when we click the reveal riddle answer button, it's just going to say, okay, go find me a p tag with an ID of riddle answer. And if that's there, then if it's there and it's hidden, I want to unhide it. If it's not there, I want to alert the user that it's not there. Okay, so that's basically what we're doing with that code down here. And then, of course, we need to call the clear all method, as we did with all the other functions. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to hide this. So we need to grab the hidden property and set it to true on this answer element. So when I click riddle me, we should see just the question and the answer should be hidden. So let's click riddle me and we get exactly what we're looking for here. So that's good. Now the last thing we have to do, so we have completed this to do, I believe. Let's just test it by clicking out or clicking on some other ones. Okay, looks good so far. And now we have to implement this reveal answers. So let's go back to our requirements here. Our user stories say, when showing a random riddle, the answer should never be revealed until we click that button. So we got that. If the user clicks reveal and there is no riddle, an alert should let the user know that there's no riddle there. If it's already there and it's already revealed, another alert should be popped up. So what we need to do here is we need to first check, let's see, what do we need to check? So what we need to check is if there is a riddle answer, or not a riddle answer, but a riddle in general. So the way that we do that is we first grab the riddle container, which will be equal to document.querySelector riddle content. Okay, so that should give us this div right here. And then from there, we can say the riddle is going to be equal to the riddle container.querySelector. And in this case, we want to search for a paragraph tag. So if there's any paragraph tag sitting within that div, we know that there's a riddle there. And if we know that there's a riddle there, then we know that we either need to reveal the riddle answer or we need to alert the user that it's already revealed. Okay, so now we're going to do an if, else if statement. So we'll say if there is a riddle, if there's a riddle revealed, and then we have one more step to do. So we need to say the answer is equal to document.querySelector, and the answer is going to be what we named it above right here. So riddle answer is the ID that we're looking for. So we just put this hashtag to search for an ID rather than a class, and we type in riddle answer. Okay, so there's our answer, and what we're going to say is if there's a riddle and there is an answer, then I want to alert the user there is already an answer revealed. Or actually no, because even if there's an answer if there's an answer hidden, it's still going to be registered under this variable. So let's go ahead and test that out real quick. Let's comment this code right now, and then we'll console.log answer. Okay, so what we would expect is we've already created in this previous method, we've created this element with an ID called riddle answer, but we've hidden it. So it's there, it's just hidden. So what we want to check is when we search for this by its ID, if it is hidden, what value do we get? So we're going to console log that answer. I'm first going to click riddle me, and then I'm going to click reveal answers. I'm going to look at the console, and you can see that even though it's hidden, we still found the element within the DOM using this query selector. So in other words, we have to check whether it's hidden. So we got to print out answer.hidden instead of just answer. So let's generate a riddle and then reveal it, and we're going to see that the hidden property is set to true. So now what we need to do is uncomment this code, and we're going to say if riddle and the answer is hidden, then we need to reveal it. Okay, so we need to say answer.hidden equals false. All right, so that line of code right there should pretty much complete our web page here, with the exception of those alerts. So let's go ahead and generate a riddle and click reveal the answer, and you can see that it reveals the answer right there. Okay, and maybe we even want to come up to this method, and instead of just setting the text content to answer, we can put the answer is, and then the answer. So let's try that one. It says the answer is in echo. So perfect. Now the last thing that we have to do is handle those other cases. So else if. So if the riddle is true, so if there's a riddle there and the answer is hidden, we're going to reveal it. If the riddle is there and the answer is not hidden, so right here, so we basically, this is redundant. So if we make it to this else if block, that means that that either the riddle was not there or the answer was not hidden. So if we get here and we say if the riddle is there, that's all we need to check. So if the riddle is there and we're trying to unhide it again, then we're going to say alert, the answer is already revealed. Okay, so let's see if that works. So we'll click the riddle, we're going to reveal it, and we're going to click the reveal button again, and it says the answer is already revealed. All right, and then the last piece is just the else statement, which basically means that we don't have a riddle at all, but we're trying to reveal the answer. So we'll say, there is no riddle to reveal the answer to. Sorry, the video cut out here. I do not know exactly where I was at, but basically we were just completing the last part here where if you click on the riddle and you reveal the answer, it reveals. If you reveal it again, it's already revealed. Or if you have a random quote and you try to reveal the riddle answer, it's going to say there's no riddle to reveal the answer to. So we've pretty much completed this challenge. Hopefully it was fun for you. A quick way that you can share this is click the share button down here and share it on Twitter. Be sure to tag me at ZG_dev and put in the hashtag 100 days of code. That's where you can get support from the tech community, the web dev community on Twitter. And hopefully we'll see this popping up a couple times. I think this is a fun little web page to create with some interactive JavaScript. And if you want to customize it a little bit, you can go down to the JS section and replace some of these quotes and some of these memes and jokes with your own